This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate what if Fem Naruto was a hollow guardian of Ichigo's family. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
After death, time passed in a peculiar manner. She couldn't say how other people responded to the afterlife, at least not to her. Despite feeling overwhelmed at the time, she had handled it well. It was still simple to recall the day she passed away and the agonizing erosion of a chain that had come from her chest in the hour that followed. She was able to cope with the mind numbing pain of hollowifying because the majority of her friends were still alive at the time. By this point, she was fairly certain that being a Jinchuriki was one of the reasons her chain of fate had eroded so quickly, when it typically took souls weeks or even years before they became hollows and lost their hearts and typically their minds. Darkness, loneliness, hate, bitterness, anger, and any other negative emotion one could conjure were all part of her life prior to joining Team 7. It had been hollow, to put it another way. She spent a few months in the living world after turning into a hollow to make sure everything was okay before leaving for her new home, Hueco Mundo, which she appeared to know how to access naturally. Though everything was white and there was an endless moon and night, it reminded her somewhat of Suna, or the land of wind in general. She didn't mind because she always loved the night, but it was during that time that she discovered most hollows were beasts. Most of them weren't even humanoid like her, and they didn't have stable minds of their own. The majority appeared to form masked creatures that were at least somewhat smaller than Kyuubi, but unquestionably weaker. She had been getting used to hollowification's operation for what felt like a month because, as she discovered, there was no reliable way to tell the time in Hueco Mundo. She believed that the majority of souls were initially just hollows, which were big and primarily motivated by instinct. They eventually advanced to the next level as their power increased with the number of souls they ate. Vasto Lords were fairly common, but Arankar, the highest evolution, were scarce. In most cases, one regained their mental faculties and, for want of a better word, a portion of their humanity in this form. No other evolution could better stifle the hollow instincts than they could. She was certain that Kurama and her enormous chakra from her life were the reasons she had completely skipped this evolving. As it was, the origin of her mask fragment was readily apparent, because she had spent so little time as a Vasto Lord herself. Vasto Lord being the evolution she'd skipped to upon becoming a hollow. She had only seen the full version once or twice while in the living world, prior to arriving in Hueco Mundo. It was a very evil fox, with a smile that would make young children shudder. Naturally, she had evolved into Arankar before she had even reached Hueco Mundo, once her power, even in death, had finally been combined with the last tail of the Kyuubi. Given that it was sentient, in contrast to the majority of Arankar's Zanpakuto, which acted primarily to contain their true power or form, she suspected that Kurama had also had a significant influence on her Zanpakuto. She didn't realize it must have been another consequence of being Jinchuriki until she encountered other former Jinchuriki. Her mother, a Jinchuriki before her, was not in Hueco Mundo, which saddened her. She assumed that Soul Society was a much happier place for her mother to have gone, but that meant that her mother had been sent there. Whether the Jinchuriki had enough negative emotions to turn into hollows or whether a Shinigami had just reached her mother sooner and her mother's chain had not eroded as quickly, she assumed it all depended on upbringing. After all, only a few people had discovered that Kushina was a Jinchuriki. Similar to her, the other deceased Jinchuriki, which included everyone except Gaara and Killer Bee at the time of her death, had begun as Vasto Lord and had entirely skipped over the subsequent evolutions. She was the one who became Arankar the quickest. Naturally, one becomes an Arankar by tearing off their mask, and none of them were aware of this until later in life. She had discovered it while still in the human world, roughly 2 months after her death. Between 5 and 9 months, the others had figured it out. She was perplexed by Kabuto's resurrection jutsu. If Itachi and the other Jinchuriki were hollows, and Itachi was a fairly level-headed Ijukas soon after his death and hollowification, how had Kabuto brought their souls back? In actuality, even though they were hollows, the jutsu had continued to function because they were souls. Sadly, his jutsu had largely taken away their free will. Otherwise, they would have just consumed Kabuto's soul and been done with it. I'm sorry it couldn't have ended there. They had returned to Hueco Mundo as if they had never left after Kabuto was defeated and the jutsu was over. Naturally, they recalled everything, and even though they were offended by being used, they had moved on. The fact that Uzumaki Miyuki had never been normal in life and that she defied all human logic, even in death, was still true. At least she occasionally saw her friends, and occasionally a hollow who she had known before would show up. The three she most vividly recalled encountering were Madara, Kabuto, and Orochimaru. Whether Vasto Lords or not, she had taken care of them quickly, sometimes with the other's assistance. They had not realized they could rip off their mask to obtain a new level of power because there were so few Arrancar. Naturally, the three main pains from their human lives probably wouldn't have stood a chance, given that she and the other former Jinchuriki could be regarded as the new Biju. They had actually adopted their Biju's names as aliases, in honor of their old tenants who helped form their Zanpakutos. Another old friend of hers came to Hueco Mundo around 80 years after she passed away. She occasionally stopped by Konoha and her friends to see how they were doing. Although she shouldn't have been surprised by Sasuke, she was taken aback when she encountered a recently evolved Vasto Lord. She initially believed it to be Itachi, but after realizing it was a Vasto Lord, she knew it couldn't be the former Akatsuki member. But she had been glad to see him again. Gaara and Killer Bee had already joined as the final Jinchuriki to perish in the time before his arrival. Together, she and Sasuke had experienced a great deal in life, including numerous death battles after he had departed for Sound. It had been one of the best days of her life when he had returned during the war. To be honest, some of her earliest human memories were vague at best, if not the happiest. However, the majority of her recollections from the age of 12 until her death at the age of 17 were fairly distinct. She had been clinging to them. As the years went by, they were praised as Hueco Mundo's gods, kings and queens, and the last Arrancar. Although Miyuki thought she could have done without the recognition and admiration, what was done by definition. They all observed that hollows were becoming less intelligent, evolving more slowly, and losing some of their former power as time went on. As one of the most frequent visitors to the human world, Miyuki could attest to the fact that things were drastically shifting. She had a suspicion that the world was losing its capacity to use its chakra as it once did. Since ninja started to become outdated and the arts were lost to the old world elemental nations, the spiritual and physical energies were no longer properly blending together. It was unlikely that there would be no more chakra users in the world by the end of a millennium unless they were as knowledgeable about life's arts as she and the others were. Miyuki and the others were dead, so it was unlikely that anyone would consider them to be a part of the extinct race. At this time, there weren't as many hollows in Hueco Mundo. 3,000 years later, things had changed significantly. The number of hollows had increased significantly, and they were sometimes even more viscous. Vasto Lords and Arrancar had become even more marginalized than they had been when Miyuki had first arrived in Hueco Mundo. However, she was perplexed by the recent rumors that the Arrancar numbers were increasing. For a long time, Arrancars were the rarest of all evolutions. She, Gaara, Yugito, Yagura, who was actually pretty likable after he got over the Madara mind fuck that had sparked the Kiri Civil War and Bloodline massacres, Roshi, Han, Utakata, Fu, Killer Bee, Itachi, and Sasuke had been the only ones for a while. Although Miyuki found it somewhat ironic that she had spent her entire life attempting to convince her village that she was not a monster or demon, basically what hollows were viewed as, she didn't mind her new life overall. She may be able to control her baser instincts, which loved fighting, hunting, and carnage, and she may still have a sound mind, but like all hollows, she had lost her heart. This was demonstrated by the hole just below her breast and above her navel, as was the piece of the mask that covered almost half of her left face, going around her eye, down her cheek, and around her ear before ending in a bone fox ear. Similar to the right side also featured a piece of her mask that circled her ear, went down her hairline, and ended with a fox line bone ear. 3 distinct black marks on the white mask resembled the whisker birthmarks she had had in the past. The whisker marks on the right side, where her face was clearly visible, were thicker and more savage looking than those on her mask fragment, but they were still there. Her appearance had not changed much from life, except for the mask. Her hair was still a little untidy, and the bangs that fell in her face had a faintly spiky appearance. It resembled her mother's hair in that it was a vivid but somewhat dark red. It was so long that it would have likely touched the Hueco Mundo sands if it weren't tied up in pigtails with golden bands that followed her all the way to her calf. The fact that she was still only 5 feet 0.5 didn't help either. As previously stated, her skin was paler than usual, and her whisker lines were darker and thicker. She still had the same vivid cerulean blue eyes, but they now had fox-like slit pupils. Even though not many people thought the old Miyuki were still alive, their legend persisted. She and the other named deities of Hueco Mundo were only known to exist by a select few. After all, that's how they liked it. Miyuki had lived in the real world for almost 50 years, most aptly in Karakura Town, Japan, which was formerly a sizable portion of Fire Country, primarily Konohagakure, and a few miles outside the formerly wooded village. The landmarks she had grown up with were long gone, and there were now big buildings and roads. But that was 3,000 years ago. Something, a particular family, kept her in the human world. From Kurosaki Masaki's mother, Misao, to Masaki's children and husband, who were still residing in Karakura town, she had known this family for about 50 years. This was what would alter the way that Kurosaki Ichigo and Soul Society as a whole were struck by the Sword of Fate. The Sword of Fate then fell. A man with red hair muttered, "You'd think she'd be on time after so many years." At the redhead's words, a woman with long blonde hair in a tight French braid, bone cat ears, and slit pupil, feline eyes laughed. "Funny," Yugito said, "when is Miyuki ever on time, Gaara?" The red-headed man, who looked about 20, let out a sigh. His eyes were seafoam green, stoic, and distinct. They had black rings around them and no pupils. His hair was disheveled, and the kanji for love was visible on his forehead. A portion of a tanuki like bone mask ran along the left side of his face, from the corner of his eye to his temple, then widened slightly along his cheek to the corner of his mouth and over his ear. The large table, which appeared to be made of marble or white stone but was actually made from the sand and minerals found in Hueco Mundo, was surrounded by 8 other people. Gaara had been of great assistance in building the big building where the 11 of them met at least once a month, as they were from the land of wind and Sanagakure, which was mostly composed of sand and other minerals. Situated in a secret area of Maino's forest, some might describe it as a castle, concealed with strong fuinjutsu and genjutsu. All of their homes, or personal territories, were, of course. She probably picked it up from Kakashi. Sensei, a second male muttered, with a hint of grudge. The individual in question had black eyes, black hair with a distinctive duck butt style, and a bone mask that formed a wing-like curve along his cheekbone from the corner of his eye to just above his jaw. He appeared no older than 17 or 18, his prime, despite having passed away at an advanced age. He had a similar appearance to another, but his mask fragment was bigger and more shaped like half of a crow's skull, covering almost half of his right face. Like the younger-looking boys, he had long, black hair. In appearance, he was only about 20 or 20.1 years old. They were all interrupted by a familiar, if somewhat childish, voice that said, "How cruel, Teme. Here I thought we'd moved past the name calling." All of them turned to face the girl who had come in. Her long crimson hair was kept in pigtails, giving the impression that she was younger than 16 or 17. The fox-like piece of her mask covered half of her left face, while the other piece was broken along the hairline on the left side, curling around her ears and rising in a bone fox ear. It wasn't quite as simple as the others, except for Gaara's mask fragment, which featured black designs reminiscent of when Shukaku had possessed him during the Chunin exams when they were 12. There were 3 whisker marks on hers. She had brought it from her human life, and it was reflected on her bare left cheek. She wore white stockings that were the length of her thighs underneath a white cheongsam that was shin length and split up the sides to her hips. Shin boots in shades of black and dark brown covered her feet, reaching just below her knees. The chiagasm itself featured crimson edges and short sleeves. The black shiki fujin was displayed on the back. She had orange fingerless gloves on her hands. Seals on the inside prevented her clothes from needing to be cleaned and replaced, even though they were invisible. She only needed to give the seals chakra, or just spiritual energy, to repair them if they were ripped or torn during a battle. After all, they didn't have many options for going out and purchasing multiple copies because they were Arankars. Miyuki, Shan, Yugito and the other girls said, grinning a little at the younger one. "Have a nice trip to the human world?" As kings and queens, they were all revered as Hueco Mundo's deities. However, unlike other places, Hueco Mundo lacked a government. It all came down to power, and those with the most were regarded as rulers. Since they were the most powerful and oldest hollows still living, things were a little different for them. Naturally, they were now largely reduced to legend, but they preferred it that way. They all understood that Miyuki was the most powerful of them all, not only because she had served as the Kyuubi's container but also because she had been a formidable human. "It was all right," she said, taking the last seat next to Sasuke and Killer Bee. "And you all?" Fu shrugged and said, "All right. Hueco Mundo has been." Hueco Mundo, her shoulder length, mint green hair moving with the motion. Killer Bee said, "Not like there's much to see around here, without rapping for a change." After what seemed like 1,000 years, Killer Bee finally reached a stage where he stopped speaking in rap all the time. He spoke like a regular person most of the time, but occasionally he would start rapping, which prevented the change from being unpleasant and spared everyone's nerves and ears, However, it had taken them some time to adjust. Everyone snorted when Gaara muttered, "I think it's nice personally." Gaara sighed and rolled his eyes a little as he arched an eyebrow at them. "Maybe it's a little repetitive at times." "That's easy for you. You grew up in a place with nothing but sand," Miyuki remarked with a small smile attached. "Anyways, is there anything to add?" According to Yugito, I've noticed hollow activity seems to be increasing." Many saw the same thing and nodded. "I've heard rumors about a large group of Arankar," Yugura said. "I'm still working on finding more on the subject." Miyuki scowled, wondering if this was related to the strange sensation she had been experiencing recently. Lately, she'd seen more hollows in Karakura and the surrounding area. "When I left Karakura, I noticed something off. I think there might be a Shinigami there." "That's not unusual," Itachi arched an eyebrow and said. "There usually are. Karakura does get a lot of hollow activity at times." Miyuki continued to frown as she nodded. "I know, but I just have this uneasy feeling, like I'm needed there." Everyone scowled since they had discovered that Miyuki's intuition was typically correct. Seeing ghosts had been commonplace for as long as he could remember. In any event, he couldn't really remember ever being unable to. The fact that he wasn't alone helped. Though only Karen was able to see clearly, his younger sisters shared his spiritual awareness. His mother was also able to see them before she passed away. Kurosaki Ichigo, 15 years old. With the exception of the spirits, his life was largely normal until the day he met her. When someone mentioned spirits, he thought of one in particular, which had haunted his family for years. Before Rukia, the Shinigami girl, showed up, he believed he knew everything there was to know about Miyuki. Many things were known about Miyuki, the strange ghost who had known his mother and maternal grandmother, but he would later discover that he was mistaken. That what Miyuki revealed to his family about her past was really just the start. He was aware that everything changed on the night of a bright, full moon. Isshin's father exclaimed, "It's amazing, a miracle," which somewhat relieved Ichigo of his shock. A truck plows right into the house, and yet not a soul was hurt. Karen muttered, "Right, a miracle," as she gazed at the hole in the house in serene disbelief. Ichigo trembled, perspiring, at the absurdity of old Goatface's behavior. Ichigo whispered, "You can't be serious," as he turned to face his sisters. The wounds he knew they had had were gone, and it was evident they also remembered nothing. Karen, at least, was considerably less convinced that they hadn't woken up from a truck smashing into the house. What human being could have done that? That kind of thing was sure to wake someone up, unless they were in a coma. I wonder if the girl returned to Soul Society or whatever it was she was referring to. Ichigo wondered what had become of the short girl. Yuzu interrupted, "Ichi.ni, you'll be late for school if you don't eat now." The orange-haired person nodded and sighed. "Right, I'll be right there, Yuzu." Whatever the case, it is no longer relevant. That thing is gone, along with her. As he followed his sister, he reasoned that there was no point in worrying about it. He was shocked to see a girl with bright crimson hair who was just as familiar when he walked in behind Yuzu. To his surprise, she sat at the table with a bowl of ramen in front of her. He still didn't understand how a spirit could eat human food, and the girl was completely enamored. She had attempted to explain it, but the notion that ramen was the food of the gods and transcended death didn't seem to fit for some reason. Now that she was looking at him, he could see more of the pieces of bone that he thought must be some kind of decoration. The fox-like pieces used to chill him when he was younger, but now he anticipated them. Without them, he wasn't sure Miyuki would be herself. It was a little awkward when she smiled, but it was eerie to see such a sweet and innocent smile next to the evil grin depicted on the mask. Though not malevolent, he couldn't help but notice that there was a hint of the hollow that had attacked them the night before in her presence. He dismissed all of this, even though it might have just been the pieces of the mask. Miyuki was just a spirit that was connected to his family. They had known her since before they had even considered him. However, Yuzu seemed to look directly over the redhead, and his dad didn't even seem to notice her presence, indicating that only he and Karen could see her. "Yuki-chan," Yuzu said with a smile while holding her ladle. "I'm glad you're back, Oni-chan." Karen raised her head from where she had placed it on the palm of her hand and gave a small snort. "She's on the other side, Yuzu, with the other ramen bowl." Ichigo's lips quirked when he realized that his younger sister was referring to the incorrect bowl of ramen. Since the girl was a ramen black hole, there were always multiple bowls made, usually by Miyuki herself. "Oops," Yuzu said, turning to her opposite side and chuckling lightly. The young girl made Miyuki laugh behind one hand, but it wasn't funny because she looked so much like Masaki and Misao. Ironically enough, Karen had a slight resemblance to Sasuke. They even had a similar appearance. Made her question whether there was any Uchiha ancestry in Misaki's or perhaps Isshin's family. About 3,000 years had passed since then, and the blood would have been watered down to the point where the bloodline was extinct. Not that it would have mattered, as bloodlines also kind of faded into legend when humans lost the ability to use chakra. Karen had come to accept it as a mere coincidence because she was the only one who resembled Sasuke. Despite how far away they would be, Misaki's family was unlikely to have any connection to Sasuke because they had originally immigrated from another region of Japan. Her knowledge of Isshin's family was insufficient to make a firm judgment, but she wasn't sure. Since she had first met Ichigo when he was just 3 years old, she had wondered about one thing. In any case, she had visited him once or twice when he was a baby, but it wasn't like he would recall that. She hadn't been there long either. She rarely stayed for more than a few months at a time. But she was off topic. She had pondered whether Ichigo was actually Yahiko's reincarnation. Although she had never met Yahiko in person, she was aware of the path Nagato had taken using his body and the information she had learned about him from Nagato and Konan. If her memories of Nagato and Konan were accurate, she had always noticed a similarity between Ichigo and Yahiko, albeit perhaps not in personality. Even though she knew Yuzu couldn't hear her, she said, "It's fine, Yuzu." Karen spent some time explaining what she had said to her younger twin, who smiled broadly and then sat down to eat her own breakfast. Isshin looked in Miyuki's general direction and exclaimed, "What did you say, Yuzu?" "Chan is my third daughter here." However, only Miyuki noticed that he appeared to be able to pinpoint her location more precisely than usual. Isshin had once been able to see her as clearly as Ichigo or Karen, but she wasn't sure if the others knew. In fact, she was fairly certain they didn't. As a former Shinigami, this was expected. She had noticed over the past few months that he appeared to be able to see her again, at least in outline. This was comparable to Yuzu's ability to see spirits, but with far greater clarity. Ichigo rolled his eyes at his father's dramatics while sitting in the vacant seat next to Miyuki, or Yuki, as the nickname was frequently used. It was obvious to him that the day would be long. The silence was broken when Miyuki and Ichigo walked toward the high school. "I heard what happened last night," she said. "Be honest with me, Ichigo, that wasn't the work of a truck, was it?" With his hands buried deep in his school uniform pockets, Ichigo peered at the red-haired girl out of the corner of his eye. He wasn't sure how to respond to her, but fortunately, there weren't many people on the streets, so his apparent introspection wouldn't raise any doubts about his sanity. "No," he muttered, staring at the ground with a deep frown. "I don't know why Yuzu and Karen don't remember. But it wasn't a truck. That girl, she called it a hollow." He pondered what Miyuki knew about hollows after noticing that she tensed up at the name. Based on her reaction and the expression on her face, he was certain she knew something. Despite her advanced age, he was certain that Miyuki had seen them before once one looked past her youthful appearance. Quietly, she asked, "But everyone is all right?" Ichigo felt a sense of relief as the lively girl's head shot upwards to gaze at him, her fox-like smile as joyfully innocent as ever. "I'm glad this girl, a soul reaper I take it, was there," she replied. "I'm sorry I wasn't around." "It's all right, Yuki," he said, a smile visible on his lips. "You couldn't have known. How do you know about soul reapers and hollows anyway?" Miyuki let out a sigh. She asked rhetorically, I never did explain my mask fragment to you or the twins, did I? I'll explain it today, after school. At least to you. Let's just say, for now, that I've had my encounters with both hollows and soul reapers." After that, the two walked in relative silence until they arrived at the school. When Ichigo saw it, he let out a little sigh and ran a hand through his orange hair before turning to face Miyuki, who had already left. He snorted and went back to entering the school grounds, unconcerned about the whereabouts of the spirit. After all, Miyuki had always been skilled at disappearing acts. The girl had been adept at vanishing and reappearing at random times for as long as Ichigo had known her. When Yuzu and Karen were younger, she had excelled at playing hide and seek with them. Although she wasn't always present, she did visit more frequently after his mother passed away. She was obviously feeling guilty about not being there to support him and his mother that day. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he failed to notice the girl he bumped into. She had darker red-orange hair that was similar to his own. A well-known dark-haired girl glared at him before assisting the girl who had been sent sprawling to the ground. When he emerged from these thoughts, he realized it was Orihime and Tatsuki. Tatsuki yelled, "Ichigo, watch where you're going," with her fist clenched and appearing to be just a few seconds away from striking him. Ichigo said, somewhat taken aback that he had failed to notice the two. "Oh, Tatsuki, Orihime. I didn't see you there," he said. "You're all right, aren't you?" As Orihime looked into Ichigo's bright brown eyes, her face flushed and her eyes widened slightly at the concern Ichigo displayed. Grinning, she bounded to her feet and retreated. With a slight stumble, Orihime turned and ran, saying, I'm fine, I've gotta go. I have volleyball. See you later, Tatsuki-chan," before running away. With his hands back in his pockets, Ichigo straightened up and pondered why the girl with the bright hair always behaved so oddly around him. He whispered, "What's up with her?" Tatsuki rubbed the back of her head and laughed softly. The girl with the black hair said, "I wonder," with a hint of sarcasm in her tone. Tatsuki glanced at the tall boy a few seconds later. "Ichigo, why exactly are you so late today? It's nearly lunchtime." Ichigo nodded and sighed. "I know, I'll tell you about it later. See ya." With some concern, Tatsuki watched her longtime friend leave. He appeared more preoccupied than normal. He wasn't usually so distracted, but she was used to him being a little moody and aloof. Miyuki sat on the school roof in an Indian fashion, biting her lip and staring at nothing. She could practically feel the wind shift, or what some would call the calm before the storm. Furthermore, she felt guilty. She didn't feel it very often. On one hand, she could count the examples. The most notable instance was when Masaki passed away. When she got back from Hueco Mundo, Ichigo was pacing the river where Masaki had perished. Although she had only been gone for 2 months or so, it was already too late for her to take any action. Though she had no way of knowing who or what hollow was responsible, she had considered pursuing whoever or whatever had attacked and killed Masaki. She could still clearly recall Ichigo's warm, joyful smiles and the last time she had seen Masaki alive. Ichigo hardly smiled anymore, and he never smiled at all. Then there was the guilt from last night, which was more recent. When she returned from her second trip to Hueco Mundo, she discovered that her intuition had been correct. She was fortunate that the Soul Reaper had shown up when she did, because otherwise Ichigo and his family would have been killed and most likely devoured by the hollow that attacked. She shouldn't have left the day before. Had she stayed? She gave a headshake. Nothing is ever resolved by what-ifs, but at least she could say that by coming back to the real world earlier than she usually would, she had somehow followed her instincts. Not that she needed to consume souls frequently, but she hadn't even gone hunting. She always ate other hollows when she did. In this manner, she could at least claim that she hadn't consumed any living beings. Miyuki's ears were twitching, which seemed and felt a little strange because she had pieces of her mask connecting there. She turned to see Ichigo and a girl leaving the school in a vacant area. Even compared to her own miserable 5.5 foot frame, the girl was rather short. Miyuki's impressive bust size was unaffected by her short stature, but it seemed as though she didn't give a damn. She had prioritized her ninja career while she was alive over her appearance. Miyuki was certain that the mystery girl wasn't human because she had a significant amount of Ryotsu, although it appeared to have been depleted along with her Riryoku. Her black hair was shoulder-length and arranged in a distinctive way, with a single bang obstinately resting along the bridge of her nose. From a distance, she could see that her eyes were light-colored, and her skin was paler than her own. It was difficult to tell if it was violet or blue. Rising to her feet, she moved toward the two of them, hoping to get a better listen. She was careful to maintain a firm grip on her Ryotsu the entire time. Ironically, she had little control over her chakra in life, but if she set her mind to it, she could conceal her spiritual pressure, energy, and chakra from almost anyone in death. However, she had had more than 3 millennia to hone her abilities. It must have been a nightmare. The girl from the previous evening could not possibly be in front of him, pretending to be a naive and kind schoolgirl. In addition to the fact that everyone could see her, the proof was right in front of him. It seemed to him that she was some kind of spirit. As in dead, as in most living people were unable to see her. She went on with the goody act, and Ichigo twitched. Few people could pull it off, but he had seen it before. Miyuki was able to teach Yuzu a few tricks, and she had done so. For instance, the puppy dog eyes. However, that wasn't important. It was unclear to him how Miyuki managed to pull off the innocent and charming act while wearing the sinister-looking mask fragment, but she managed to do it. He believed that Kuchiki Rukia could not pull it off. He said, "First of all, stop it, it's not fooling anyone with that goody shoes act." "It's pretty good, if I do say so myself," Rukia said, putting her hands behind her back and giving him a quick glance before speaking. "Especially since I only found out about it last night." Ichigo laughed. He shook his head and mumbled, Yeah, right, now tell me why you're still here. Do you not have somewhere to go back to? Soul Society, or what? Rukia let out a sigh and turned her gaze away from her new orange-haired acquaintance, wishing she could go home, but it didn't seem possible, at least not for a while. I can't, she said, because Soul Society is only accessible to spirits and soul reapers. Last night, Ichigo, I lost almost all of my abilities. Ichigo's eyes briefly widened. What? She gave a solemn nod. You took almost all of my power, as I mentioned. I'm just compelled to wear this guise until they come back so I can go home. Gi. Guy? He asked foolishly. Yes. When we soul reapers need to regain our strength, like myself, or are on significant missions in the real world, we use this fake body. It enables people to perceive us as though we were also living people. Ichigo realized, so that's why everyone could see you, and muttered something under his breath. After hearing his whispered words, Rukia replied, exactly. But the most important thing about this is that I can no longer do my duty as a soul reaper. What? Why not? Startled, Ichigo demanded. She shot him a grumpy glance. Ichigo, are you unable to guess? Rukia shook her head and went on. No, you, Ichigo, have to take my place and carry out my responsibilities as a substitute soul reaper until I regain my abilities. I can hardly even perform a basic Kido, let alone stop any hollows that might attack. He would have done something, shouted that he wasn't the type to save the world, that he'd only done what he'd done last night to save his family, but he didn't have the time. Instead, he was startled by the sudden burst of laughter, which bordered on cackles and giggles, as a crimson and white figure fell from what seemed to be thin air. Ichigo blinked multiple times as the words took some time to sink in. He and Rukia turned as the laughing body hit the ground, causing a small dent, but the long-haired girl appeared unharmed as she rolled around on the ground, still laughing uncontrollably. Rukia blinked at the strange sight, and Ichigo twitched. What is going on here? Rukia forced herself to ask herself. Will you please stop it, Yuki? It's not amusing, he shouted, kicking the laughing girl with his outstretched leg. He knew Miyuki could take it, if she let herself be hit, and he was not surprised when the girl deftly sidestepped his kick, which was one of the reasons he had no trouble hitting a girl. The girl laughed and got to her feet, wiping away the tears that had fallen. As her laughter gradually subsided, Miyuki said, Ahaha. I'm sorry, it's just so funny. You're a soul reaper, hee. A vein on Ichigo's temple throbbed as he twitched. When the orange-haired boy grabbed the girl with the red pigtails, which were very long, and held her against his chest, Rukia looked between the two and blinked at their antics. She had witnessed bullies and human children and teenagers giving what they called noogies to their siblings or friends. He put one arm around her stomach and the other around her chest, closer to her neck, as if he were trying to subdue her or give her a painful noogie. As much as Rukia hated to admit it, she was somewhat out of step with 21st century human behavior, and she had serious doubts that this was some kind of mating ritual. Stop talking. It's not amusing. Does that mean I can't be a soul reaper? When Miyuki ignored the position he had her in and kept laughing, Ichigo narrowed his eyes even more. It's just an image I never thought I'd see, Kurosaki Ichigo, a soul reaper. I performed admirably last night, Yuki, and I'd make a fantastic soul reaper, Ichigo yelled as he messed up the shorter girl's hair with his right arm. Miyuki fought harder because she didn't want to damage her hair, which wasn't easy to make follow her in the first place. Being so long, it wasn't always easy to maintain, but aside from occasional trims, it had always remained long, just like her mother. She wasn't a girly girl, but she did have one pet peeve, and that was when someone messed with her hair, like Ichigo was doing right now. Miyuki huffed and attempted to repair the damage after she broke free of his hold, gasping for air from all the laughter. It wasn't as bad as it could be, but she would soon need to remove her pigtails and redo them. She mumbled, a little pouting, that was a low blow, it'll take me 5 minutes just to brush it out and put it back up. Ichigo remarked, TCH, shouldn't have laughed, nothing funny about it, and expressed gratitude that no one else was present. If anyone had seen him, it would have likely looked strange. Basically, he was wrestling with air. Miyuki smiled at the boy after gathering herself. The idea that the boy was just another cocky, conceited, stick-up their soul reaper, who seemed to know better than anyone whether all hollows were the same, lost souls, mindless beast, and didn't even consider making a distinction might not be amusing to someone else, but she had known him for years. Given that many Shinigami had previously encountered her and tried to purify her evil, it's possible that she harbored some resentment. She rolled her eyes and asked herself if she looked evil, but she didn't think so. She was a hollow, of course, but that didn't mean she didn't have any thoughts or feelings, even though most hollows these days were mindless, evil creatures that only lived to devour souls. However, despite Ichigo's protective nature and strong character, she found it ironic and humorous that, based on the Soul Reapers she had seen, Ichigo would make a fantastic Soul Reaper. At least until the short girl regained her abilities. I apologize. I was just drawing a comparison between your personality and the Shinigami I had previously met. I think it's more of an inside joke, but I found the idea that you were one amusing. Miyuki was relieved that her mask fragment concealed one from view because she was unable to control the flush that overcame her cheeks. In reference to her mask, Miyuki stole a peek at the black-haired Soul Reaper, and sure enough, the girl was sufficiently recovered to allow for a closer inspection. She started counting, thinking, any moment now. 2, 3, 4. Rukia said, a hollow, in a startled, slightly poisoned voice. Ichigo, get away from her. Ichigo's eyes widened and he glanced from Rukia to Miyuki, who appeared resigned, as though she knew this was coming. Rukia had assumed a defensive stance and appeared ready to attack at any moment. Ichigo started off by saying, wait. Rukia, don't, this is just Miyuki. This is a hollow, Ichigo. Her spiritual pressure is palpable to me. Even though it's well hidden, it's unmistakably that of a hollow, and even though the mask is broken, it's still a hollow mask. More than asking, Miyuki said, can't we discuss this like adults, and Rukia rushed forward. Rukia cursed the slow body she had to use as Miyuki danced around her, effortlessly dodging every blow. As everything started to make sense, Ichigo muttered, a hollow, and fixed his gaze on the redhead. That would explain. But if she's a hollow then why, he said. Ichigo shook his head and stepped in between the two girls, but just as he did, Rukia unleashed one of her spells, which Miyuki narrowly avoided, dragging him along with her to avoid being struck. Ichigo. Startled by his meddling, Rukia screamed. Shorty, be careful where you send those things, Miyuki yelled, mocking the Soul Reaper, who appeared enraged by the moniker. Whoa, please stop talking, Ichigo shouted. Rukia, my mother and grandmother, as well as I, have known Miyuki since I was a child. We all assumed she was a spirit, of course, but she has been in the family for decades. Your mother, Masaki, was aware of who I was. Misao, your grandmother did the same. Miyuki sighed and said, I guess I don't have a choice now that I've blown my own cover. I told you I would explain everything after school. Miyuki moved forward, extending one of her gloved hands as she glanced at Rukia. Hi there, I'm Uzumaki Miyuki. I'm an Arankar. Rukia appeared perplexed by what the redhead had called herself and shocked by how courteous she was. Arankar? She asked. To the best of her knowledge, Vasto Lord was the only evolution, so she had never heard of that before. Well, a Vasto Lord can remove their own mask and advance to the last evolution, Arankar, if they so choose. We regain some of our humanity, intellect, and physical attributes there, along with a Zanpakuto. Hey, Zanpakuto do you have? Rukia gasped in surprise and asked. Of course, said Miyuki, gesturing to her side with a radiant smile. A long katana, like blade, was enclosed in a black sheath with black ribbon wrapped around it. The hilt was also wrapped in black ribbon, with some of the same ribbon hanging down and connected to the bottom. Rukia wondered what the blade itself looked like. The majority of Arankar Zanpakutos differ from Shinigamis. They are merely the location where one would store their abilities until they were ready to be released. Some people, including myself, do possess some form of Zanpakuto spirits. I don't know why I and a few others have Zanpakuto spirits while most Arankar don't. Although we have theories, there is no way to verify their accuracy. Rukia wanted to ask about the other people she mentioned in their theories, but she knew from the way she had phrased her sentence and the look on her face that she would not elaborate. She started to relax a little, but it was obvious from her narrowed eyes that she did not trust the redhead. I see. So, Hollow, you've been close to Ichigo's family for some time? Did you participate in it while you were alive? Rukia inquired. Would you mind being sent to Soul Society by a Shinigami? You're still a Hollow, so you have to continue eating souls. Despite rolling her eyes at the girl, Miyuki responded because she could tell by Ichigo's gaze that he was also interested in the answers. Yes, I was acquainted with his mother's mother, and Masaki was a close friend. Since hueco mundo is just sand, it's pretty dull, and I guess I grew attached to the Kurosaki family. I'm much older than I appear, and I wasn't a member of the Kurosaki family when I was alive. The reason I don't allow myself to be killed is straightforward. Would you allow yourself to be killed? As you mentioned, I am still a Hollow, so I must eat, but I survive on hollows. I don't have to eat the souls of the living and the dead. Ichigo gazed at Miyuki for what seemed like an eternity, thinking about everything he had learned and whether he could trust her. She acknowledged that she was an Arankar or hollow, but his mother and his grandmother, whom he had never met because she had passed away before he was even born, had trusted her. His chest ached at the thought of her being gone, but he knew that it didn't matter what she was. He had known her for years, and if she was going to hurt him or his family, she would have done it by now. They couldn't stop her. No, aside from his few friends, he trusted her more than he trusted anyone else. Thanks for telling me, Yuki, Ichigo said at last. It doesn't matter to me what you are, I trust you. He gave Miyuki a brief, fleeting smile in return for the bright smile that Miyuki had given him. Rukia sighed, knowing that there was nothing she could do if Ichigo trusted the redhead, and that the hollow had, as far as she could tell, been truthful in her responses. It was dark, hollow. Like, don't get her wrong, but it lacked the certain evil taint that hollows had, and there was also a lack of evil intent in her presence, which was present in every hollow she had felt. Fine, but I don't trust you yet, Rukia replied. I'll be watching you, hollow. Miyuki looked at her drearily, unimpressed. My name is Miyuki, Soul Reaper, use it. With somewhat icy eyes that were similar to Miyuki's own blue eyes, Rukia gave a small nod. Mine is Rukia, Kuchiki Rukia. Ichigo was starting to feel as if it were snowing, the tension was getting so thick, and the two girls just stared at each other frostily for what felt like forever. About your calling, Ichigo. Since you possess my abilities and I do not, it makes sense that you should look after them for me. Only until I regain my abilities, Rukia finally stated, averting her gaze from the redhead. Ichigo turned away and stuffed his hands in his pocket, saying, No, 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 no. I'm not the kind of person to risk my life for a complete stranger. My monster fighting days are over. Miyuki grinned. I believe you told me earlier that you would be a fantastic soul reaper, with a playful tone, she said. He twitched his eye. That won't work, Yuki, he replied. I'm not falling for that reverse psychology crap you pull. Miyuki sneered, it's just me being honest. It's not reverse psychology. I'm sorry to say it, but Shorty is right. Are you incapable of doing it? I could, said Miyuki in a low voice, but what's the fun in that? Besides, you took away all of her abilities. Therefore, you are to blame for your current predicament. Rukia mentioned, the hello. Miyuki is right, a little taken aback that she would ever concur with a hollow. You have to do this, Ichigo. He said, no, and started to leave, not a chance. With a sigh, Rukia produced a red glove featuring a burning skull. She muttered, you leave me no choice, then, and departed. Ichigo turned to see what she was referring to, but his spirit was expelled from his body as her hand struck his forehead. Miyuki smirked after blinking and snorting. She muttered, that looked fun, and laughed as she saw Ichigo freak out while wearing a huge sword on his back and now dressed as a Shinigami. After a few seconds, a Rukia phone alarm went off. What is that? When Ichigo had finally calmed down enough to think clearly, he asked. A hollow is nearby. Ichigo pointed to the redhead. Yeah, Miyuki's right there, he said. Miyuki was a little taken aback by Ichigo's easy acceptance of her. With no time to ponder, Rukia halted abruptly, turned to face the redhead, and wondered why her phone hadn't warned her of the girl's presence earlier. Saying, no, it's not her, it's another one, Rukia took Ichigo by the sleeve and said, let's go, you have work to do. Miyuki, unsure whether to accompany them, rolled her eyes as she looked down at Ichigo's body, picked it up, and leaned it against a tree. She was trying to make him appear to be asleep, and since he was at such an angle, it was unlikely that anyone would notice him. Miyuki nodded to herself and turned back toward the path taken by Rukia and Ichigo before quickly vanishing. With the exception of the previous night's hollow, Miyuki couldn't help but like Ichigo's handling of his first hollow as a substitute soul reaper. After hiding Ichigo's body, she had no trouble keeping up with the two, and she had arrived at the park just in time to witness the argument between him and Rukia over the young spirit being pursued by a hollow that resembled a spider. She was not going to allow the hollow to consume the spirit. Although she preferred to keep out of other hollows' affairs, she did assist if she saw a child's spirit being sought after by a hollow. The fact that she didn't have to worry didn't surprise her. By chopping off the spider's legs, Ichigo demonstrated to Rukia his unpredictable nature while acting as the protector he was. So, you've decided, Rukia expressed with a hint of smugness. Ichigo narrowed his eyes and gave her a growling look in return, but Miyuki wasn't sure Rukia's hearing was good enough to pick it up. He exclaimed, I haven't decided squat, leaving Rukia stunned. You can't expect me to just stand by while someone needs help. I decided to save that boy because I wanted to, you hear me? What about you? Ichigo asked, turning to face her. Wondering what the boy with the orange hair was talking about, she said, me, what about me? He narrowed his eyes at her and said, I remember you went out of your way to help me and my family last night. Tell me, were you really thinking about your duty when you came to my aid? Of course not. That's the last thing on anyone's mind when they're saving someone. Rukia saw the hollow get back up and start charging at Ichigo as he hefted his big Zanpakuto up. He beat her to it before she could say anything. At the very least. I choose, Ichigo said, turning to the side and extending his blade with icy, determined eyes, to be different. Rukia watched in mild amazement as the hollow started to disintegrate after being impaled through the mask on the blade. Although she didn't know him well, she acknowledged that she had never anticipated this from him. He had a peculiar moral code in addition to being near an Arrancar in a hollow. He contradicted himself by saving random strangers despite his claims that he didn't care. But if that made sense, his words ran counter to the contradiction. Although Rukia wasn't positive, she was attempting to convey that she was impressed. Everyone turned to face Miyuki as she exclaimed, well done, from her tree branch. I especially enjoyed your speech, putting Shorty there in her place. The redhead laughed at the startled, then irritated, and angry vibes the Soul Reaper exuded. If she could get over her dislike of hollows, she thought the short girl would be fun to irritate, but she also thought the girl would make a good friend. Perhaps she should learn to relax and take off the stick. As she had witnessed far too often in the clans during her lifetime. The girl did, in fact, remind her somewhat of the Hyuga clan. Perhaps there was a connection? After saying, Miyuki, Ichigo blinked upon seeing the ice cream in the girl's hands. It was a waffle bowl filled with hot fudge, crushed cookies, and chocolate and vanilla ice cream. He twitched a moment. You stopped for ice cream, at a time like this. As she approached them, Miyuki smiled, shrugged, and joyfully put a spoonful in her mouth. She had to get past the boy spirit as she approached them, and he noticed her and started to slowly crawl away. No, no more monsters, exclaimed the boy. Please, don't eat me, I wouldn't taste very good anyways. Both Ichigo and Miyuki froze, though Ichigo's froze was primarily caused by surprise at the boy's words. She turned to face the young boy, who shook briefly and appeared afraid of her. Because of this, she avoided interacting with many souls and made an effort to avoid them. The girl smiled kindly, blinking once as she gradually pushed back the hurt caused by the boy's words. She knelt down and extended her hands, containing the other half of her ice cream. Miyuki vowed, I won't eat you, I promise, I'm not even hungry, I swear on my mask. Here, do you want the rest of my ice cream, kid? She had always been good with children, even when she was alive, and her voice was as kind as she could make it. Sakura used to claim that she had a strong maternal streak and would be an excellent mother, but she had never had the opportunity. However, it wasn't as if she couldn't die. Arrancars had reproductive organs, whereas hollows typically did not. Naturally, no birth between hollows had ever been documented. At least not for almost 2 millennia, if not more. Unless you were killed in battle, it was difficult to keep track of time when you lived forever. The girl with the frightening mask fragment and the same presence as the monsters pursuing him were the objects of the spirit boy's weary gaze. However, it was also distinct, less malicious, and resembled a controlled chaos. He went forward slowly, reaching for the ice cream, which he hadn't had in what seemed like years after his death. Since he was never truly hungry, he had been unaware that he could eat anything. The boy, who didn't know her name, said, Thank you, Fox. Chan, identifying the fragment of her mask as that of a fox. At least it made him think of one. Rukia remarked, that was kind, despite the fact that she had never seen or heard of pluses or hollows consuming food, especially human food. She thought it was digested and turned into reishi. Ichigo nodded and grunted, then approached the boy who was eating the last of the ice cream and knelt down. Ichigo tapped the boy's forehead with the handle of his Zanpakuto and said, Listen kid, if you want monsters to stop finding you, then you better hurry and move on. As the boy vanished into Soul Society and was drenched in light, Miyuki grinned. Although she had only witnessed a small number of soul burials, they were stunning events. As for how she knew anything about the house where the majority of souls reside in Soul Society, she had her ways, and if only Rukongai were operated more efficiently. She had previously been there, if only to look for the people who were most significant to her. While some were happy to remain in Rukongai, others had been assigned to comparatively good districts, and some had become Shinigami. Some weren't as fortunate. The majority had reincarnated after dying again. She hadn't returned to Rukongai. She had avoided Seirei itself for more than 3 centuries, so it wasn't like she could sneak in frequently. She grinned a little as she recalled the few occasions when her presence had been noticed. Naturally, she had long since vanished by the time they started searching for the Ryoka. She suspected that Yamamoto, the elderly man, had a snitch and had entered and exited almost undetected. Good times, good times. Rukia said, that was beautifully done, as she walked up to the teenager with the orange hair. Ichigo turned, taking a moment to acknowledge Miyuki as his customary frown deepened. He said, I'm out of here, but he paused after taking a few steps and looked at Miyuki. You coming too, Yuki? Rukia was left staring at their retreating figures in surprise as Miyuki nodded and gave a small smirk before rushing a few paces to catch up to the taller boy. The dark-haired girl was clearly unsure of what to do. Ichigo gazed at Miyuki, absorbing all that he had discovered over the previous hour and a half. He had assumed the redhead was merely a spirit, even though he was aware that there was a lot about her that he didn't know. She didn't have a chain, to be sure, but he had assumed that it was either hidden or that she was old enough that it just fell off, like a newborn's umbilical cord. In hindsight, he realized that making such an assumption was a little stupid. Aside from the mask fragment, which has since become much more noticeable, she also showed no indications of being a hollow. Never once had he seen her without it. At the same time, he had never noticed a hole like the ones he had seen on each of the 2 or 3 hollows he had seen thus far. However, it provided a wealth of information about Miyuki. Slit pupil eyes, more akin to a fox than a cat. Her canines resembled the fangs of a fox or other animal, and the marks on her only exposed cheek resembled 3 whiskers. She had a darker undertone, but after spending so much time with her, it wasn't as obvious as it was with the hollows he'd battled. It had no evil or malicious intent, but it felt hollow now that he had something to compare it to and was searching for it. He had known her for a long time, and that was one of the reasons he knew he could trust her. He was certain that she would have killed them long ago if she had wanted to, but more than anything, a part of him told him she could be trusted with his life because it made his chest tight and his heart beat oddly. With his family's life. He had always had faith in his intuition. He sat on his home's roof and asked, why did you never tell me? I understand why you didn't tell Dad, Karen or Yuzu. Miyuki questioned, would you have understood? I've always told those I've become attached to, like you mother and grandmother, who and what I am. I may leave things out, or omit details of my life. As you can imagine, my human life is a touchy subject at the best of time. Ichigo gave her a worried look as Miyuki sighed and shook her head. He hadn't intended to bring up her past, if it had been upsetting. He would acknowledge that he was only aware of her name during her lifetime and death. That she was not well liked in the village where she had lived and had been an orphan. Since she used the word, village, to describe her home, he had always assumed she was a few centuries old. Villages like that hadn't been seen in 400 or 300 years. He was aware of that because he had studied history sufficiently. But, with the exception of a few, I've always waited until they were ready. I had planned to explain when you were 17. True, it's not that much longer, about a year give or take, but I guess I was afraid you might not want me around if I told you sooner. Ichigo nodded and said, I get it, particularly after Mom. I still wish you'd told me, but I understand. Unable to complete that thought, Ichigo trailed off. She whispered, thank you, loud enough for him to hear. Before his curiosity about the girl overcame him, he asked, Miyuki, if you're a hollow, then where is your hole? Do you not have one? Miyuki gave a small snort, cocked her head in his direction, and grinned. With one eyebrow up and a playful tone, she questioned, didn't someone ever tell you it's rude to ask where a lady's hole is, Ichi-kun? Ichigo shook his head and waved his hands in front of him, seemingly in a desperate surrender, as his eyes grew wide. No. That's not what I meant. I meant your hollow hole. Ichigo trailed off, blushing red with embarrassment as he saw the redhead start laughing. That was a cruel trick, Yuki. Miyuki stopped laughing and her grin widened. You're the pervert who thought I meant another hole, she remarked, laughing at Ichigo's embarrassment over the entire subject. She took Ichigo's hand with a cunning expression in her blue eyes, and to Ichigo's surprise, she placed it on the spot directly below her breast. All this did was make the boy look like a hot pepper. That is, if a hot pepper had orange hair. Yuck. What? Ichigo's eyes widened and he gave up trying to take his hand away when he saw that Miyuki's white Chinese style dress was bent inward, as though the space beneath the fabric was hollow, due to the pressure she was exerting on it. Is that your hollow hole? Miyuki took her hand away from Ichigo and let him take his own after she was certain he understood what she was attempting to demonstrate. It wasn't as though she was embarrassed by the hole, and he had asked, She had long since moved on from it. She would have shown him the hole, but wearing the white cheongsam that was shin length and what she usually wore made it difficult. Miyuki shrugged and remarked, "Well, you did ask where it was. I'm not ashamed of what I am, Ichigo, though I do prefer the term Arankar. Makes me feel a little more human, what good it does me." Ichigo nodded. That made sense to him. He was still perplexed, though. How had she turned into a hollow in the first place? Hollows were monsters, like demons. Did Arankar differ from other species, or was it something else entirely? He had already questioned her about her hollow hole, which was probably a rather personal question, so he didn't think it was appropriate to ask again. Ichigo said, "I should go in," and stood up. "Are you staying?" After a moment of frowning while making up her mind, Miyuki nodded. "Yes, but I'll probably leave sometime during the night. I have something I need to do." She laughed and her eyes lit up mischievously when he asked, "You're not going to tell me, are you?" Miyuki responded, "I would, but why ruin the surprise, more than merely asking? You'll find out tomorrow." Ichigo nodded, gave Miyuki a hand up, though he wasn't sure she needed it, and then started to head back inside the house. Rukia returned stealthily to her closet. Well, Ichigo's closet, as she had nowhere else to live and was just using it. One of the reasons she hadn't told Ichigo was because she felt ashamed of this. She would stay out of sight until she realized she would eventually be unable to conceal it. It wouldn't be good to be caught listening in, especially since she had just overheard a very private conversation. As a Kuchiki, she was taught not to act like a nobility and to avoid eavesdropping, so she didn't usually do this, but she had overheard a portion of their conversation and couldn't help listening. She could only defend it by saying that at least she now understood Miyuki a little better. She had been attempting to comprehend the concept of a hollow. No, Arankar, she told herself, that wasn't determined to devour every soul it liked. It was an unprecedented peaceful one. But perhaps that was because they had never attempted to obtain the whole story before destroying hollows, she thought, gazing up at the closet ceiling. Rukia didn't believe there were many hollows like Miyuki, but she acknowledged that she didn't exactly take to trying to determine whether or not the hollows she was sent after were evil before she attacked. It would take some time before she could trust the girl without doubting herself, though, because she was still tired of Miyuki. "Ichigo, have you seen my pajamas? I can't find them." She heard Ichigo sigh in frustration as she turned to look at the doors. "No, Yuzu, I don't know where your pajamas are," he responded. "That's strange, I'm missing a few dresses as well." Karen also mentioned she had some jeans and shirts missing, along with a pair of shoes. Since they were the only ones with clothing in her size, Rukia grimaced at this. She detested having to borrow Ichigo's sister's clothes. It appeared to have been noticed even though she had been careful not to take much. She ignored the rest of what was said, but her phone's beeping soon alerted her to a hollow, interrupting her thoughts. Blinking in surprise, I flipped it open. Her eyes widened and she sat up straight, opening the closet door and putting on her glove almost simultaneously. "A hollow, now?" she asked. She jumped out of the closet and yelled, "Ichigo," startling Ichigo and Miyuki. Miyuki shook her head in response to Ichigo's yell. "Huh, what the hell are you doing in there? Have you been there the whole time, and are those my sister clothes?" The entire house would hear him if he kept going at this pace. Although it was a miracle that nobody had. Isshin had a chance because she suspected that he was already realizing that Ichigo was a Shinigami. Rukia sprang forward, slamming her palm into his head and removing his spirit from his body. "No time, we're not alone," she said. Miyuki grinned and wondered if she would be able to obtain that glove or one similar to it. It appeared enjoyable even the second time, though perhaps not for Ichigo. As Miyuki leapt from Ichigo's bed and saw a hollow emerge through a black portal at the head of his bed, her eyes widened and she cursed her own carelessness. "A hollow," Miyuki uttered, squinting. Ichigo reached back for his Zanpakuto and muttered, "Here? Damn it." Before he had his sword in his hand, Ichigo and everyone else leapt back again. Rukia said, "Don't just stand there, attack it, aim for the head." Ichigo exclaimed, "I know," and struck, slashing at the hollow's head. With a twitch, Miyuki reached for her Zanpakuto. She felt he was being a bastard, but Sasuke would say she had a hero complex because she wanted to help. At least she didn't have a hero complex. She no longer went around saving people. Even though Ichigo was one of her closest friends, she knew that if she handled battles for him, he would only suffer more harm in the future. She knew she would need to discuss training with Ichigo as she stepped back, her eyes narrowing, and she watched him eliminate the hollow. If Ichigo wanted to survive against more powerful hollows, he would need experience, which he lacked. Since her fighting style might not be the best for teaching Ichigo, perhaps one of the others could assist her if she asked politely. Additionally, she was aware that she would support him. She knew herself well enough to not avoid every conflict. She enjoyed a good fight, and even she was unable to fully stop herself from defending others. She wouldn't fight with him now, but she would when the time came. It was best that Ichigo was the only one to attack in the small area because the hollow wasn't very strong and was most likely new. With her own thoughts starting to cloud her judgment, Miyuki closed her eyes. Why was it necessary for things to be so complicated? A few seconds later, she heard the hollow roar, breaking her reverie. The reverberating human undertones startled her. She recognized a hollow's roars, but she wasn't sure if the other two heard it. Although she had only been a Vasto Lord for a brief period of time and was now an Arankar, she had heard many stories, including her own. When she lost her human life and heart, she hadn't really changed all that much. Before the hollow's damaged mask escaped through its portal, she saw it and gasped. Knowing that the revelation would surely shake Ichigo, she walked over to him. Before it became a hollow, neither she nor Rukia had explicitly explained what a hollow was to him. It's... he asked, human underneath the mask. Miyuki gave him a grim nod. It's kind of obvious, after all. I once had a mask that covered the majority of my face as well. Ichigo gave Miyuki a startled look. You were once like that. Not exactly, I was never a normal hollow. After I died I was instantly a Vasto Lord, the highest evolution for those who don't know of Arankar, she said. Her admission appeared to have shocked Rukia. That's impossible. I've never heard of a hollow that started out at that level. Miyuki shrugged as he turned back to face Rukia. Well, nowadays you don't, shorty, but I'm older than I look, as I've said, and it is possible. It depends on the power the plus soul had before their chain erodes. Nowadays that doesn't even matter, unless they were spiritually aware and there aren't many strong enough to skip an evolution. It happens, but very rarely. Rukia could not think of anything to say. What was Miyuki's exact age? Ichigo said, wait, his eyes wide. You mean to tell me those things are humans? I mean, I assumed Miyuki was once human, but I thought that maybe she was another species or something, being an Arankar and that it tied in. It wasn't human, Ichigo, not anymore. Hollows are the souls that lose themselves to negative emotions. Regret, pain, loneliness, hate, rage, despair. Their chain of fate erodes over time and before a Shinigami can send them off they become hollows, losing their hearts. Miyuki gave a nod. Miyuki shocked Ichigo by saying, that is more or less correct. The holes you see in hollows are the symbol of our lost hearts, and some believe, our souls. As he gazed at her, he had never before seen Miyuki so solemn and gloomy. I don't personally believe the latter. Even hollows have souls. If we didn't, then Shinigami wouldn't be able to purify hollows and send them to Soul Society. They'd simply be destroyed. Understanding, Ichigo murmured, purified? The souls of the hollows are sent to Soul Society after they're killed, then? Both Miyuki and Rukia nodded. Rukia slipped a glance at Miyuki, who noticed and gave a slight scowl. Along with any souls they've consumed and became part of the fold, she said. Ichigo didn't see this conversation. At least she decided to eat other hollows, so sue her for having to eat. In addition, she carried a Zanpakuto, and since it contained a spirit, similar to a Shinigami, any souls from the hollows she consumed were gradually purified, and she retained the sustenance that came from eating. Rukia wasn't in the mood to share the information, but she could live without knowing that just yet. Rukia said, we should go, and shook her head. The longer we wait here, who knows what that hollow is doing. Ichigo gave a somber nod. He looked at the two girls who gasped in surprise and said, right, but... that hollow, I saw its face, and it was Orihime's dead brother. Miyuki grabbed Ichigo's Shiakusho's sleeve and pulled him out the window, saying, we need to go, now, with Rukia right behind them. Yuki sat up and looked over to Ichigo, who was staring at the hollow in disbelief, cursing herself for lowering her defenses. As she recalled Orihime's brother's story, she was overcome with sadness. When a good soul was forced to hollow Fi, it was incredibly sad. Given that he was currently battling the hollowification, it was clear that his transformation into a hollow was caused by more than just his soul lingering too long. Miyuki interrupted Ichigo as she started to approach Rukia to assist her with Orihime and Tatsuki, saying, wait, don't Sora. Ichigo was certain that he saw the glazed over with a sheen of tears, which was not typical of Miyuki. No, Ichigo, she said, looking at Sora with sad eyes. He'd be better off moving on. When it comes to hollows, there are the lucky ones and the not so lucky ones. There is no saying he would be able to retain his conscience and mind. Most do not. I wish there was another way, but it is clear Sora-san does not wish to continue on as a hollow. Ichigo turned back to Sora, who had the sword ready to purify him, and swallowed the lump that had grown in his throat from all the emotions that were permeating the air. The hollow gave a nod. "Your friend is right," Sora stated. "I didn't become this by my own choice, and I don't want to live as one either. The pain, the hollow feeling is too much for me to bear. I proved this to myself by nearly killing my precious little sister." Ichigo nodded in comprehension while lowering his gaze. If his and Sora's roles were switched, he would feel the same way. Orihime spoke up, stopping the hollow as Sora closed his eyes and prepared to impale himself. "Wait, please. I need to say something," Orihime exclaimed, blinking tearfully at her brother. Miyuki had arrived where Tatsuki was nearby and was checking on Rukia, who was crouching by her side, tending to her wound. Orihime choked on a sob as tears fell, but she managed to sit up and smile a little as she went on. "This hairpin. Do you remember the argument we had about it, the day you gave it to me, Aniki? I said I didn't like it because I thought it didn't look grown up enough for me. I know I hurt your feelings, and you left without saying anything else. And that was the last time I saw you alive. So now I want to say what I should have said to you when you went off to work that day. Bye, big brother. Have a good day." Sora grinned. "Thank you, Orihime, and goodbye. One day we may see each other again, Imoudo." They all watched as Rukia tried her best to console the girl as Orihime sobbed and Sora ran the Zanpakuto in his hands through himself, dissolving him in blue particles. Miyuki even put a supportive hand on the typically vivacious girl's shoulder. However, she wasn't sure if she was of any assistance at all because it had been a while since she had had to console someone. Miyuki got up, took her hand off Orihime's shoulder, and walked over to Ichigo. To get his Zanpakuto, he had gone. Miyuki said, "Hey, you alright?" And Ichigo turned to face where Sora had been. His gaze was fixed on her. "I should be asking you," he said. "That was a pretty nasty hit you got earlier." Miyuki rubbed the back of her head where it had struck one of Orihime's house walls and waved it away. "It's nothing, he just caught me off guard," she replied. "I'm a lot tougher than I look." Ichigo nodded, seemingly certain of that. Ichigo sheathed his sword on his back and said, "Let's go, I'm sure Rukia has a plan as to what to do about Orihime and Tatsuki." He turned to see Rukia using a device on the two girls, and Orihime had returned to her body. As Ichigo asked Rukia what she had done to them, Miyuki stayed behind and considered how things were actually starting to change. She wondered how much worse Ichigo's luck could get before it ended. She left early, at about 6, taking care not to wake Ichigo, who occasionally slept very lightly. Additionally, she didn't want to wake up Rukia or the other residents of the house. It wasn't likely. She considered Ichigo's reaction to her surprise as she yawned and darted across the town. She hadn't done anything like this in a long time, but it would be worthwhile if only to relieve her boredom and watch Ichigo's expression upon seeing her. That is, if he recognized her. Miyuki halted her run at a familiar store and smirked as she emerged from her reverie. She could easily read Urahara Shoten on the sign. A tall man in brown and green, with a white and green hat covering his pale blonde hair, stood outside the store, as if he was watching the sunrise. She knew his eyes were gray, but it was difficult to see them. He twirled a cane in his hand and now grinned at her. Miyuki said, "Kazuki, long time no see," and moved forward. Urahara Kazuki nodded, then his smile grew a little wider. "Yuki. Heim, long time indeed." Miyuki twitched at the nickname, which she found annoying, but she had grown accustomed to it. Still the same, she shook her head and muttered, "So, do you have it ready?" Urahara gave a nod. The redhead followed him into the store, and the door closed behind them. "I believe so, come in," he said. 46 years ago. November 1955. "Misao, come back, you'll be late as it is." As she fled the Kurosaki estate, a girl with gingery, orange hair smirked and flew behind her. Although her father and grandparents were quite traditional and strict, her family wasn't as snobbish as the Ishida clan, another Quincy clan. She took advantage of every chance to get away. She bounded into the clearing, a medium-sized pond in front of her, her gray, blue eyes sparkling. It would be at least 2 hours before they thought to check for her there, even though her mother occasionally took her there for training. "They'll never catch me," she declared, grinning slyly as she walked toward the pond. Misao gasped as she looked into the glistening water, turned, and, with a swiftness that would have pleased her family, had her bow out and was prepared to shoot at the girl in the tree. Her eyes were closed, and she had pale skin with whisker birthmarks on her cheek and long red hair that resembled crimson flowers or dark blood. But it was the fragment of the hollow mask that had triggered her reaction. She couldn't tell if the girl was meditating or sleeping. The girl was only a few years older than her older sister. Was she even a hollow, for that matter? The hollow vanished before she could see it, then reappeared a foot or so to her side as she hesitated to release the arrow. She suppressed a shiver as she got a closer look at the fox. Like mask. It was really unsettling, especially since the girl had a small smile on her face. Her bright, almost glowing, azure eyes were very fox-like, and had a bored warmth to them. She thought the girl looked like a kitsune. As the redhead put it, it's not nice to aim weapons at strangers. Misao's face flushed red as she looked embarrassed and couldn't help but let her bow fade. For a moment, she forgot that the girl in front of her was probably a hollow. Misao stammered, then straightened up and narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? You're a hollow, aren't you? Do you expect me to let you eat me, or something? When Misao raged, hands on her hips, the blue-eyed girl appeared amused. She saw that the girl was slightly taller than she was. The hollow girl couldn't have been much taller than 5 feet, but she was 4 feet 7.5 and still growing. Based on the girl's curves, she estimated that she was probably 16 or 17. Misao was just 10 years old. When she said, "I try not to eat things that would give me indigestion or heartburn," Misao's mouth fell open. Was that a joke from the girl? Was she simply suggesting that she wasn't edible? Misao knew it wasn't rational, but it was offensive to be told by a hollow that they wouldn't bother eating them because of something so human, like heartburn or indigestion. That's why she would make her sick if she did. What's that supposed to mean? The redhead then grinned, and a few seconds after that, she started laughing. Blinking, Misao gazed at the white-clad girl, who was now almost on her knees, laughing and crying. After calming down from her outburst of laughter, the redhead slowly stood back up. "Haha, you're okay, kid. Ha ha ha," she said. "I haven't laughed that much in decades. Usually people don't react like this, but maybe it's just you. So, what's your name, little Quincy?" Finally, with an owlish blink, Misao replied, "Misao, Kurosaki Misao." With a fox-like smile, the redhead grinned. "I'm Miyuki, Uzumaki Miyuki." Standing behind her desk, she said, "Okay class, before we begin today I have an announcement. We have a new student joining us today." Ichigo wondered who exactly would have enrolled so late as he looked up at Ms. Ochi. Only a few days ago, Rukia had been the final new student, so it seemed a bit unrealistic to have another one so soon. When the door opened and Ichigo heard soft footsteps, he looked up again, his eyes widening at what he saw. Well, he believed it to be Miyuki. He didn't recognize her at first, though, because she was different and appeared entirely human. He only knew it was Miyuki because of the blue eyes, even though they lacked the slit pupils, and the thinner, whisker-like marks. But she looked so different that he started to doubt himself. Her hair was not in its typical pigtails, but it was still the same shade of red. Her hair looked shorter than usual, but he had seen her wear it down before. It was as long as her calf now, and half pulled up with a white cord, where normally it barely touched the ground when down. It trailed down her back, making it easier to see that it wasn't just messy but also faintly waved. She no longer wore the white cheongsam or the typical girl's uniform, and her face was no longer concealed by the piece of her mask. She was dressed in a dark red, or perhaps maroon, seifuku, though the skirt was longer than he had noticed. But she was still wearing her usual brown leather boots. She turned to the teacher and said, "Hello, my name is Uzumaki Miyuki," grinning and bowing briefly. "I apologize, sensei, for not having the standard uniform. They are out of my size, so it's being ordered, and shall arrive in a few days." "It's okay, I get it," Ms. Ochi said. "You may sit in the free seat behind Orihime. Inoue Orihime, please raise your hand." As Miyuki moved past him to where Orihime was seated 2 seats over, Ichigo continued to stare. He remembered the conversation they had had the night before rescuing Orihime from her hollow-eyed brother, and he didn't miss the amused smirk she shot his way. "Was that a gigai?" Urahara said. "Well, here you are, Yuki." Pointing to the gigai that was in storage. "Same as you left it." Miyuki rolled her eyes as she observed the gigai's altered attire. She squinted as she turned to face Kazuki. "You didn't change the clothes, did you, Kazuki?" Urahara stepped back, blinked, and covered his face with his fan. His knowledge was that Miyuki's use of that tone of voice was never auspicious. He responded, "Of course not, Miyuki, I had Ururu do it," and Miyuki agreed. Someone else might find it odd that a young girl who appeared to be no older than 10 or 11 could lift a gigai to change its clothes. However, Miyuki was aware that Ururu was more powerful than she appeared to be. "Thank you, Kazuki," she said, "I owe you one." After saying that, Miyuki entered the gigai, which a moment later responded by opening its vivid blue eyes. After not using a gigai for more than 10 years, Miyuki stood up and moaned at the cramps. Normally, she wouldn't need a gigai to be seen. She could be made corporeal to humans by concentrating her chakra and riryoku into an even mix, but that wouldn't help much with the mask fragment that would make her less than human. In addition, it took over, which she did have, but she was only able to maintain it for 3 days before having to stop and start over. Simply put, a gigai was more practical and had a more human appearance. Urahara followed Kurosaki out to the front of the store and inquired, "So, how's Kurosaki doing? I felt him awaken with the help of Ms. Kuchiki the other night." Miyuki scowled for a moment. "He's doing well, I don't think we'll have to worry all that much about him. Though, I have a feeling things are about to get complicated. I know enough about Soul Society to know there is a law against giving one's powers to a human." He gave a nod. "I guess we'll just have to wait and see." As she arrived at her seat and took a seat behind the girl with the burnt orange hair, Miyuki scowled a little. Her suspicion that Urahara had knowledge of something he was keeping from her persisted. The man had more secrets than those dumb fans he used to cover his face to conceal his expressions, so she wouldn't be shocked. She recalled how, in the first year she had known Urahara, she had broken so many of those fans that she thought he would start crying every time. When she struck him with them, she usually broke them over his head. She couldn't resist giving Ichigo a sidelong glance and grinning as she listened to Ms. Ochi start the lesson. She was correct. The expression on his face upon seeing her was invaluable. As they stood on the roof for lunch, Rukia questioned, "So this was the surprise, a gigai?" Rukia smirked mischievously after Miyuki gave her a strange look. Miyuki looked down at Rukia, who was a few inches taller than her, and said, "Ah, so you were listening in last night," her bangs casting shadows over her eyes. "I thought I felt your ryatsu." Ichigo looked away from the two girls and twitched, rolling his eyes. Among them was a pitiful attempt to refute the charge. Rukia finally gave up on trying to deny it and sighed while fiddling with the juice box. "So I know I shouldn't have, but I was still weary of you then," Rukia said, maintaining a focused gaze on the juice in her hands. "I'm sorry. Now, could one of you tell me how exactly I am supposed to drink this?" With a snort, Miyuki grabbed the juice box from the girl with the shorter black hair. Rukia blinked as she returned the now open box to her, saying, "It's really easy. Just stick the straw through the hole and drink." Muttering, "Strange," Rukia put the straw to her lips and drank. The taste was a pleasant surprise to her. Similar to fruit, yet simultaneously sweet. "Good, huh? That's why I enjoy the human world so much. We don't have such things in Hueco Mundo, and hollows taste like pulverized crap." Ichigo and Rukia both winced at that, the image itself sending shivers down their spines. It wasn't really necessary for them to know the taste of a hollow. Ichigo shook his head and remarked, "Way too much information, Yuki." She laughed, then stopped, staring up at the sky some 15 feet west of them. Rukia and Ichigo followed suit in a matter of seconds. She was worried for a moment, but she calmed down after the garganta opened and the figure emerged, allowing her to better sense their spiritual signature and the fact that she could also sense their chakra, which only a select few, including herself, could still use. "A hollow? Here?" Ichigo asked, startled that one would show up so near the school. With a simple glance, Miyuki stopped Rukia's words and put a hand on his chest, halting his movement. She said, "Don't worry, it's a friend," and Miyuki let her hand fall from his chest as they both gave her wide-eyed looks. "Hello, Gaara. What brings you to the human world?" Rukia and Ichigo were both unaware that the hollow had joined them on the roof, a foot or so away but close enough for them to see him clearly. He was about 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7, a few inches taller than Miyuki. He was pale, dressed in odd black and maroon garments, and carried a gourd on his back that resembled a peanut. A piece of mask, not of a fox but similar to Miyuki's, was on one side of his face. Compared to Miyuki's fragment, it covered less of his face and was more canine or feline in nature. Additionally, rather than being plain, it had markings that resembled black swirls. Like Miyuki, he had untidy red hair, odd, pupilless seafoam eyes, and black rings around his eyes that resembled raccoons. In fact, it was simple to compare him to a tanuki given the fragment of his mask. Although his stoic expression reminded Rukia of her brother, it was also entirely different, and Byakuya, Nisama and this man did not share any resemblance. Given their striking resemblance, Ichigo and Rukia pondered whether the Arrancar was related to Miyuki. Gaara said, "Yuki," and turned to face the two people his old friend was hanging out with. He felt his lips quiver into a tiny smile and raised an eyebrow at the taller boy with the startling orange hair. Orange. Only you would find a person with orange hair to become close to. I am not surprised. Ichigo twitched in frustration, his frown deepening as Miyuki snorted. Gaara shook his head when he snapped, "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Gaara was just pointing out how I used to wear a lot of orange. Nowadays I've cut down on how much orange I wear, but when I was still human I could blind the enemy with how much orange I wore," Miyuki said, coughing to get their attention. Ichigo was not particularly surprised, but he did perspire at this. He knew that autumn, when orange was a popular color, was her favorite season because he had witnessed her go crazy over orange items. Additionally, she had never said anything negative about his hair color and had always been there to support him when he was younger and being teased for it. She had always commended it. Rukia's response was more subdued. She blinked in surprise but wasn't necessarily let down by what she had discovered about the mystery that was Miyuki. "Who is he?" Rukia finally questioned, pointing to the red-headed man who looked at most 20 years older than Miyuki. She had to admit, not bad to look at either, which was shocking in and of itself because she had never imagined that she would find a hollow, of all things, to be even remotely attractive. "I'm Sabaku no Gaara, an old friend of Miyuki's." The odd last name made them both blink, but they dismissed it. Miyuki was the only person Ichigo had ever heard with the name Uzumaki, so it wasn't like there were many people with that name in the world. "I'm Kurosaki Ichigo." "Kuchiki Rukia," Rukia greeted, nodding. To be honest, she didn't know what to say, but she wisely didn't say much more. All of her opinions about hollows were being disregarded in the past few days. She lacked the self-confidence to avoid saying something inappropriate and upsetting Gaara or Miyuki in the process. She barely knew either of them, so she couldn't completely trust them, but at least she was making an effort. "Miyuki has spoken of you Kurosaki-san, though she's never mentioned a Shinigami." With a nervous laugh, Miyuki broke in, saying, "Yeah, Rukia is a new acquaintance of mine. There was an incident a few nights ago, and she ended up giving her powers to Ichigo." Gaara gave a nod. "I take it you'll be spending a lot more time here then, if the guise is anything to go by," Gaara said in addition to being asked, and he kept saying, "Anyways, I come with news. Yagura found some information around his territory. Seems the Arrancar population has begun to go up as drastically as rumored. It's centered in a place nearly in the center of Hueco Mundo, called Las Noches." This second part had been spoken by Gaara in the language they had used when they were alive, which was just an older version of Japanese. She blinked and asked, "Lost nachos? Someone lost their nachos, in Hueco Mundo?" Gaara sighed and started to perspire before he corrected her. "Las Noches, it's Spanish as most hollow abilities and such seem to be," he replied. Ichigo turned to face Rukia, their brows furrowed at the few of the two's words they truly understood. The Japanese language had changed more than he had anticipated over the course of 3 millennia. He muttered, "Lost nachos? They're discussing food?" And Rukia shrugged, equally perplexed as he was. "No idea," said the girl with the raven hair. Rukia was too preoccupied with figuring out how old Miyuki might be to speak such an ancient, yet remarkably similar, dialect of Japanese. Since she was genuinely unable to determine the exact age of the language, she estimated it to be at least 600 years old. She would assume it must be one of the older forms simply by hearing it. She reasoned that it must be fairly close to modern Japanese because it was so similar and they could understand a few words. She had no idea how off she was by her estimated age, which is why she chose the number she did. But now she was aware that her estimate was only a guess. She wouldn't know much about Miyuki's past unless she persuaded her to talk. Rukia might be very interested in Miyuki's and, consequently, Gaara's past, but she wasn't so ruthless as to pose as friends with the Arrancar in order to obtain information. Her inability to accept that Miyuki was a hollow, even though she possessed Shinigami-like abilities, was the only thing preventing her from making a sincere effort to become friends with the redhead. It was difficult to overcome more than a century of being taught that hollows were demonic spirits that required purification. It would take her longer than a few days. As she processed the information Gaara had given her, Miyuki sighed and began to feel enraged at the notion that someone had claimed land over which he had no legal claim. Particularly if Yagura was correct and the Palace of Las Noches was built by a Shinigami. 8 of the new Biju had selected areas that were reasonably close to each other when the 11 of them had chosen territories. This was because, in most cases, maps only depicted the general location of an area rather than its precise size. These regions included the north, south, east, and intermediate regions. In contrast, she and the two Uchiha families had made their homes in the southeast, northeast, and east, respectively. Her territory ended up being the largest, even though she hadn't meant it to be. The 11 of them, who were close friends and comrades, were less territorial and welcomed in each other's lands. But in the past, when Hollows understood they were more than a myth or legend, everyone who lived in their domain was aware of the regulations, particularly with regard to the 9 of the former Jinchuriki. Those who attempted to usurp them or trespass were dealt with. Along with their instincts and a few minor personality traits, their tenant's chakra merged with them, transforming them into the new Biju. Furthermore, they were hollows. Well, at first, it was more difficult to control the instincts. Being able to control oneself was now instinctive. But the main point was that none of them were happy because Las Noches had taken parts of her, Fu, and Killer Bee's territories. More so her two friends than her own. They would leave it alone for the time being because, at least, they knew exactly where their enemy was. Since Las Noches and its inhabitants were unknown, they were automatically enemies in their eyes. Additionally, whoever had it constructed unintentionally positioned it so that it was encircled by their territories. With the enemy all around, it gave the saying a completely different meaning. At last, Miyuki said, "I see, going entirely back to modern Japanese. Thank you for the update, Gaara. I don't know when I would have been able to return to Hueco Mundo." After saying, "We thought as much, if something hadn't have happened then you would have returned to let us know," he turned to face the smaller girl and the boy with the orange hair. "I must return, and let everyone know what's going on here." Miyuki gave a nod. Ignoring Rukia's shocked gasp, she started, "Right, before you go though, will you think about helping to train Ichigo?" And she was certain that Ichigo's eyes were wide behind her. "Ask Karasu and Taka for me as well. I plan to train him so he can be prepared, but my style may not be the best option for him." The use of Itachi and Sasuke's nicknames, as well as the names that are legendary in Hueco Mundo, caused Gaara to raise an eyebrow before nodding. "I will," he declared. "Be careful, sister." Watching the other redhead cut the air, open a garganta, and depart through it, Miyuki waved. With a sigh, she pushed her loose hair behind her ear. Although she hadn't anticipated seeing one of them here, she wasn't shocked that they sent Gaara given the information Yagura had discovered. Ichigo asked, perplexed, "Sister, he's your brother then?" Miyuki shook her head and grinned broadly at the orangette. "No, not by blood anyways. We were close friends and comrades in life, the same age, though he died many years after she replied. "We did get that a lot though, both having similar hair colors." Rukia bit the inside of her cheek, wondering if it was too soon to inquire about it. "There are more of you. You mentioned Karasu and Taka?" she asked. Miyuki just gave her a funny look. "There are 11 of us, the oldest Hollows or Arankar still around. I'm not surprised our legend isn't well known in Seirei or at all. We were given the title of Kyosakai no Kamigami, or deities of the Hollow world. Each with a name we chose to be called by other Hollows, as our given names were something more personal that we didn't desire to give to just anyone. After a while we fell into the background, as we never truly wanted such a title nor to get involved with other Hollows' business. Then we simply faded into legend, into myth. Few realize we're still around. Karasu and Taka are very old friends of mine. I've known them the longest, since I was a human child in our village. Unlike the others, they're blood brothers." Both Rukia and Ichigo were taken aback by how much she had disclosed, but Ichigo at least understood why. Rukia had asked, and Miyuki didn't dislike her. He assumed that Miyuki had intended to tell them about her past at some point, but she was just not prepared to sit down and tell them everything. Rukia was looking at the red-haired Arankar with wide eyes. "The oldest Hollows or Arankar still around," she said, her words soaking in. Rukia was certain that the girl had to be close to the same age as the Gotei 13's Sotecho in order for that to be feasible. There was no other explanation, but she couldn't be certain unless Miyuki came out and told them her age. After all, Hollows had existed for thousands of years, but it was unknown how old a Hollow was before encountering a Shinigami. They didn't approach each Hollow they killed and inquire about their age. It was terrifying to consider that Miyuki was almost as old as the most influential man in Soul Society. As she went on, Miyuki didn't seem to notice their odd appearances or care. "You'll probably meet them in the future, if they decide to help me out with Ichigo's training." Ichigo said, "Training?" And Miyuki grinned. "I figure you could use a little help. Not to insult Rukia or anything, but we can't expect you to learn completely through battle experience. That's just asking for you to get hurt once you run into something that has more power than the common Hollow." Rukia glanced down, feeling a little bad for not considering that. After all, The academy was founded on the principle that Shinigami were trained before being sent on missions. However, she was happy Miyuki had considered it. She whispered, "She's right," and Ichigo gave a nod. After he said, "Okay," the bell that marked the end of lunch sounded a few seconds later. Miyuki said, "Come on, we don't want to be late," and the three departed the roof to head to their subsequent class. After a few weeks, Ichigo felt that nothing could be more out of the ordinary. On the other hand, Miyuki found it enjoyable because it provided her with something engaging to do, even though she occasionally couldn't get rid of the overwhelming sense of dread. As though a storm was on its way and she had no idea how big of a mess it would be. Miyuki had no time to gripe about boredom because of high school and the hollows that showed up almost every other day. She didn't particularly enjoy the school-related aspects of her ordeal, though. She questioned how people could put up with doing this kind of thing for half of their lives. She was unsure because the majority of civilians were taught at home by their parents. She recalled that there was school when she was alive, but even the civilians didn't go after the ages of 13 or 12. Hell, a student could graduate from the ninja academy almost every year, and it lasted for only 4 years. She was only promoted to genin at the age of 12 after learning the shadow clone and defeating Mizuki, despite having failed the exam 3 times herself. She assumed that was all irrelevant. The main idea was that Ichigo was fortunate that she liked him so much because not everyone would go to such lengths to assist him in his new role. However, she had only really started training him and assisting him with more evasive hollows by flinging a few clones around. She had only ever really aided him once, and that was against Shrieker, a particularly nefarious hollow. The so-called artillery of the Shriekers spat out of their mouths like bombs, and Miyuki glared as one of her shadow clones was destroyed. She narrowed her eyes slightly in determination as she looked at Ichigo, who had shed his body and had his Zanpakuto ready. She sighed and grimaced, "I'm down to 5 clones. Makes that 2 clones. You ready? This one is some of the worst out there despite being young." Ichigo nodded, although he appeared a little surprised by what she had said. "How do you know he's young?" Miyuki gave a snort. "He's got quite a bit of intelligence, that's true, but even the young hollows can possess that. The fact is he's simply a hollow, not evolved, but still one of the more powerful hollows we've crossed so far." Shrieker, obviously irritated by her clones, came to stand in front of them and demanded, "What is this nuisance? You are not a soul reaper, are you some sort of witch then?" This caused Miyuki to raise an eyebrow and mutter, "That's a new one." Whatever. Ichigo advanced in a position that Miyuki had assisted him in. The frog.bat hollow clearly irritated him. "Your fight is with me, Shrieker." The hollow chuckled before unleashing his leech. Bombers in the shape of frogs. Ichigo rushed forward as Miyuki retreated a step. He swung, effortlessly slicing through the frogs. A few seconds later, Miyuki gasped in realization as he asked, "K, that all you got?" Miyuki looked back at the leeches that were still pulsing in the frog's guts, which had spilled out on the ground around Ichigo and were still very much alive, as Shrieker laughed once more. As she figured out why Ichigo's question had the hollow so irritably amused, she suppressed a gasp. "Aren't you forgetting something, substitute Soul Reaper?" After a few seconds of trying to figure out what Shrieker was getting at, Ichigo's eyes widened. Despite her knowledge that the bombers were unlikely to cause him any serious harm, Miyuki hurried to his side. Even when she was alive, she had a strong instinct to protect, but she was still unable to control it. Miyuki had already arrived at his side as the bombers were detonated, kicking up dust and smoke while obstructing Rukia and Chad's view. They saw a confused Ichigo standing in a gleaming dome of golden, orange chains after the dust had settled. Chains that seemed to be emanating from Miyuki's body. With her eyes wide as she took in the chain barrier that left Ichigo and Miyuki unharmed, Rukia exclaimed, "What the? Is this for real? Is this part of her abilities as a hollow?" With barely more than rage in his voice, Shrieker demanded, "What are you, girl?" Then, shaking the slight astonishment he felt, he scoffed, "It doesn't matter, die." Just as the chakra chains broke into embers of golden, orange particles, the barrier vanished, and Ichigo's eyes narrowed, his arm shot out. He suddenly lunged forward, almost severing Shrieker's arm from his body with his sword. Ichigo gave a gloomy grin. "You shouldn't have threatened my friends, Shrieker." "You little runt," roared Shrieker, painfully rearing back. He had a very sharp Zanpakuto at his throat just as the hollow was about to attack. Ichigo said sharply, his eyes glaring like dark ice, "Tell me, you're the reason Yuichi is stuck inside that cockatiel, aren't you? You're the reason his mother's dead." "So what if I am?" Miyuki's eyes became more and more icy. Those who killed for the sake of killing were the one thing that the crimson-haired Arrancar detested the most. Those who turned other people's suffering into a game. She focused on bringing her Zanpakuto to life, her fist clenched, her eyes hard and icy azure blue. She rarely had to let it go unless she was training with one of the others, but she was unable to do so while in her guise. Few ever deserved their weapons, much less their full potential, to be released. A long, rather thin, but razor-sharp sword sliced through Shrieker's chest, causing him to cry out in agony. With a startled expression, Ichigo followed the blade up to the hilt, where two pale hands held it, and back up until his brown eyes met blue ones. He muttered, "Am I Yuki?" as his eyes darted from her unmoving face to the black hilt of her sword. The void black hilt was encircled by black ribbon that ended at the pommel. The blade was a dark, bloody crimson and several inches longer than a typical katana. A few shades darker than her hair. When Miyuki twisted her blade, Shrieker let out a cry of agony. The majority of hollows experienced pain even though they had a high pain threshold. In addition, Zanpakuto was a component of her chakra, soul, and power. To a foreign system, her Biju chakra was extremely painful and corrosive. The majority of Biju chakra was, but not as much as the Kyuubi no Yoko had been. Or may have been. Her eyes flashed as red as her hair as she said, "You make me sick," her voice full of disgust for him. "It doesn't matter what your answer is, you're still not leaving here alive, that is my promise." Ichigo had never seen Miyuki in this state before, but he simply nodded and returned his focus to Shrieker given the situation. Yuki was correct. The hollow would not survive. After withdrawing her Zanpakuto, Miyuki started talking, hissing and moaning. The kid was easy to manipulate. He believed anything I told him. If I said I could turn the sky green, he'd take it as truth, so when I told him I could reunite him and his mother, he practically asked how high he should jump. Amused by his own memory recall, Shrieker laughed. Reminding Yuichi of Rukia's question, Miyuki asked out loud, "Why? Why would he believe that?" Still laughing, he confessed, "Because he wanted to believe. You see, I did kill the twerp's mother. Oh, she was a tricky one. I stabbed her 8 times yet she still ran, all the time protecting the kid." The hollow gloated over his most recent kill, and Ichigo and Miyuki listened with sick attention. Ichigo suddenly understood why this sounded so familiar. "Wait, you're that serial killer from a few years ago," he said. Smugly, "Oh, so you do know of me. I'm glad," he said. "The fact is I got sloppy. I followed the kid to the balcony, to make a clean job of it. Then the snot-nosed brat caught my shoelaces, and I lost my balance. I fell, 20 stories down. Who would have thought? Taken down by a kid. Still, I was dead. I was pissed and I wanted payback." Shrieker chuckled quickly. "So I tracked him down, sucked out his soul, and stuck it in that stupid bird. I told him if he could run from me for 3 months I'd bring his mommy back to life." With wide eyes, Ichigo exhaled. "What? How could you do that?" Miyuki sighed, thinking she heard a glimmer of hope in his voice. This entire experience must serve as a painful reminder of Masaki's passing. Miyuki said, "He can't," as she turned to comfort Ichigo by meeting his eyes. "Bringing someone back to life is beyond anyone's abilities, not even the Ryo. Sama himself could accomplish that, and his power far exceeds even my own." She spoke this final bit more softly, primarily for Ichigo's ears, though it's unlikely that Shrieker would have understood if he had. She doubted he was popular with hollows, and he was much too young to have heard the legends yet. The fact that there had once been a method to bring the dead back to life, too, in fact, was not something she bothered to bring up. She was certain that the Nidaime Hokage probably regretted creating the first one, which was an abomination, and the second one, which involved self-sacrifice. One life for another. "Your little girlfriend is right. I couldn't bring her back. No one could, not after what I did to her." She was aware that Ichigo was being negatively impacted by the Hollow's ongoing remarks. When the Hollow made fun of Yuichi's affection for his mother, his eyes widened. As a result of her ninja training and more than 3,000 years of experience, Yuki maintained her composure. However, given that she had lost it before, she had been prepared for it this time. Then, she had been taken by surprise. Ichigo's reaction was much more vicious than she had anticipated. After snatching the leech bombers from the air, he punched the Hollow, piercing the part of his mask that covered his mouth. His eyes flashed as he asked darkly, "Aren't you gonna activate your bombs now? Come on, do that thing you did before to set them off, no?" She heard Rukia gasp in surprise, and a smile that bordered on cruel appeared on his face. This was a new side of Ichigo to Rukia, but then again, neither had she. If she claimed it didn't startle her a little, she would be lying. Ichigo started removing his hand. Well, if you're not gonna use it, he said. Then by all means, let me relieve you of the burden. Shrieker's tongue was pulled out, and he roared in agony. My tongue. Son of a bitch. Ichigo threw the tongue away from him, and hollow eyes glared at him. I'll kill you. Ichigo snorted, sneered, and leapt forward, slicing Shrieker's mask like butter with his sword. Rukia came closer. Ichigo and Miyuki watched as the doors to hell materialized and started to open, and he screamed in his last moments. Ichigo's stomach turned for a second when he sensed the sinister prescience behind the doors, but it was insignificant compared to Miyuki's response. As though to keep herself together, the Hollow Queen stepped back and folded her arms across her midsection. Her wide blue eyes even showed a trace of fear. Mumbling, "The gates of hell," Yuki said. Rukia moved to stand next to Miyuki after nodding. She wasn't overly surprised that a hollow would have negative consequences near the gates. For hollows, it was most likely similar to the bogeyman humans told their kids about. Ichigo looked back at them and said, "What?" He glanced at Miyuki and saw right away that she took one last step back when Shrieker was impaled on a kind of spear inside the gates. She felt a faint chill that most people wouldn't notice, but he had known Yuki for longer than he could recall. He said, "Yuki, are you alright?" At last. Rukia told Miyuki, "The gates aren't here for us," looking at her. Attempting to be consoling or at the very least understanding. Being around the gates wasn't always pleasant for her either. The Zanpakuto of a Shinigami may cleanse a hollow of sins, but only those committed as a hollow. To those souls that were wicked in life, like Shrieker, the gates leading to hell opens to claim them. Miyuki ran a hand through her hair and sighed in relief as the gates finally closed a few seconds after she had finished explaining. Being terrified of the gates of hell was somewhat embarrassing, but it was innate for all souls, whether they were good or evil, alive or dead. If she died, she didn't even know what would happen to her. She was, if she could, an Arankar, but she was also a Biju, and a Biju could hardly die. Not only was she afraid of Hollow Instinct, but she was also curious about what would happen to her soul after she died. To hell, Soul Society, or the cycle of reincarnation? As a shinobi, she had killed a good number of people during her lifetime, but she never enjoyed it. But if they ever really died, was that the only place they could go because they were Biju? She was aware of how stupid she was. In addition to having lived in a different era, she had previously visited Soul Society and encountered numerous shinobi. To be honest, Kiba, Hinata, Neji, Rock Lee, and pretty much the entire Rookie 9, plus a few others. Not all from Konoha. Shinobi had a tendency to preserve most, if not all, of their memories after they passed away, though it all depended on how strong one was while alive and how much, if any, memory they retained after death. This happened as a result of their use of chakra. She didn't like seeing the gates of hell open, but she didn't think anyone did. Yuki. Yuki. Chan, are you alright? That instantly jolted Miyuki out of her reverie. He had not added the suffix since he was around 9 or 10, so it was uncommon that he called her Yuki. Chan. By the time Masaki passed away, his smile had all but vanished. Miyuki grinned up at Ichigo as she turned to face him. I'm fine, just not fond of those gates, she started. I've only seen them open a handful of times, and that was one time too many in my opinion. Agreed, Ichigo said, returning his sword to its sheath on his back. Zanpakuto, Miyuki's creation, had long since vanished. Come on, I'll see if I can place Yuichi's soul back into his body. Rukia murmured. You'll have to preform a Kanso if not, Ichigo. Miyuki remained silent as Rukia examined Yuichi's soul chain as the three of them approached the location of Ichigo's body, Chad, and Yuichi. When it became evident that the only assistance they could provide would be to Kanso the boy, she let out a sigh. Yuki could only hope that Yuichi was placed in a comparatively good district of Rukongai after witnessing him being sent onto Soul Society a few seconds later. She hadn't personally seen it in a while, but she didn't think much had changed. Yuki said, I'm sorry we couldn't do more for Yuichi, Chad, to the taller teenager. In fact, she had to bend her neck slightly in order to meet his gaze. Rukia probably had it worse than she did, but at least she wasn't the shortest of the four. Chad gave her a quick nod, but she could tell he knew there was nothing he could do. It is all right, I realize you did the best you could. When Ichigo's body started to stand again, Chad hardly reacted, but she simply assumed that Rukia had given him at least the fundamentals. Miyuki, I have to ask, how were you able to create those chains and materialize your Zanpakuto in Gigai? Miyuki gave Rukia a long look as though he was attempting to decide whether or not she deserved an honest response. At last she responded, My Zanpakuto is strongly bonded to me, and as I might have mentioned before, has a spirit much like a Shinigami's would. Even in Gigai I can materialize it for a time period, but I can't release it or end up obliterating my Gigai and possibly half the block. Rukia was clearly taken aback. And the chains? Ichigo gave a nod. Yeah, they seem to be coming from your back or something. Yuki scowled. She said, that is more complicated, after giving her response some thought. Let's just say it's something I inherited from my mother, and leave it at that for now. Rukia nodded despite appearing dissatisfied with the rather cryptic response. Although she understood Yuki had her reasons, she was aware that she kept a lot from them. Ichigo nodded more quickly because he knew she would elaborate when she was ready. She was happy that she could do more than just assist Ichigo in his training. Additionally, she could honestly state that she had come to like Kuchiki Rukia, the Soul Reaper, over time. Even though she was young, at least by Miyuki's standards, she demonstrated competence when it mattered. One of those occasions was approximately a week following Gaara's visit. The Hollow had taken on Shrieker after the young boy's soul became trapped in a crocodile, and consequently, Chad. She had arrived in time to witness Chad helping to eliminate the Hollow without even being able to see it, proving the value of both of them to her that day. Rukia had displayed a fortitude and determination to persevere that she was unaware the noble girl possessed. She had been soothing Yuzu prior to her arrival because Ichigo and Karen had both abruptly vanished, but after she had finished, she had pursued them. She would first encounter Ichigo and Karen, with Ichigo needing to return Karen before he could focus on the danger. He had sent her after Rukia without any delay. Initially, Miyuki had viewed Rukia as stupid for facing a Hollow with little to no strength. She would later acknowledge her mistake, and if she had been Rukia, she most likely would have done the same to buy Ichigo time. Additionally, Rukia had demonstrated her willingness to assist Ichigo in learning about Soul Reapers that Miyuki was unaware of. Ichigo, regrettably, was not a Kido type. Miyuki was reminded of her own human problems with chakra control. At least she didn't know how to assist Ichigo with that yet. Yuzu called out, Yuki. Ni-chan, breakfast is ready, breaking her reverie of the previous few weeks. I'll be down in a minute. Yuzu. Isshin had insisted she stay with them when they first met, even though she had planned to find a place of her own. He had seen her Gigai at his and Masaki's small wedding ceremony, so she wasn't shocked when he recognized it. He had surprised her by offering her Ichigo's bed, but Ichigo could sleep on the couch until the guest room was free of boxes of stuff that had been stored. She didn't mind a futon on the floor of the boys' bedroom, but she had refused to take Ichigo's bed. Unexpectedly, and sooner than she had anticipated, Isshin had agreed. Unfortunately, Ichigo had received a lengthy lecture about being a gentleman, not taking advantage of girls who shared a room with him, which made her think he knew Rukia lived in his closet, and always using protection if they gave in to temptation. She nearly felt sorry for Ichigo, but his response was hilarious. Nearly. Ichigo sat up in bed and sighed. She forgets this is my room too. I think my sisters like you more, Yuki. With a laugh, Miyuki approached the door. I'm sure that's not true, Ichigo. With a shrug, Ichigo stood up and followed her outside. She went into the bathroom, probably to shower, and he went on to the stairs. When he said, I'll see you downstairs, Ichigo went downstairs after Yuki nodded as she closed the door. As she jogged to catch up, Miyuki called out to Rukia, Hey, wait up. Her bright hair flew behind her. Rukia grinned as she looked over her shoulder. It was still unbelievable to her, even after weeks of getting to know her, how well Yuki fit in as a typical 16-year-old girl. Well, nearly 16 for her cover. She had disclosed that October was her birthday month. Rukia was skeptical that anyone would ever figure out that the girl before her was a hollow. She said, Miyuki, and the girl smiled, but it wasn't phony or entirely genuine. Rare were the genuine smiles that made it to her eyes. Only those closest to Rukia had seen them given to them. Now that she considered it, such as Ichigo, his family, and that Gaara guy. But she had almost forgotten about him by then, and they hadn't seen the other Arankar since. Let me walk with you. I also have something to pick up from Kazuki's, Yuki said to her. As they started to move in the direction of the Shoten, Rukia scowled and furrowed her forehead. If you don't mind me asking, what are you picking up? Her violet and blue eyes met, and Yuki's fox. Like smile said, the same thing as you I figure. A special Gikongan I've used in the past to get out of my Gigai, should I ever need to. That made sense, Rukia said, nodding. She never seemed to leave her Gigai, which was explained by this. You seem capable without leaving your Gigai, though. I've never seen anyone able to materialize their Zanpakuto in Gigai, or use those chains of yours. Yes, Well, it took practice, and Kazuki especially designed this guise for me. With me being an Arrancar and all, there were certain modifications that needed to be made, she said with a brief chuckle. They were just a few seconds away from the shoten when Miyuki laughed at the way the red-haired child in front of them was treating a slightly older, dark-haired girl. Rukia, who saw the two as well, had a similar look. She assumed their names were Jinta and Ururu. Rukia interrupted the two and asked, "Why is it you're always fighting when I see you?" Miyuki continued, attracting the now wide and somewhat alarmed gaze to her place next to Rukia. You shouldn't pick on girls like that, Jinta," she said. "I'd hate to have to let Tessai know." Jinta practically stammered out, "Am I?" Miyuki and Ururu blinked up at them a couple of times before grinning with a slight flush of shame. Tessai, who appeared to have heard his name, asked from inside the store, "Is there a problem?" "Nothing. Just sweeping, just sweeping," Jinta uttered rapidly as he gripped the broom and swept as far away as he could. Following his lead, Ururu bowed to the two teenagers before she did. In response to the two's antics, Tessai shook his head and said, "Jinta, Ururu, come inside and help there, please." He bowed slightly and held up a hand as he turned back to face Miyuki and Rukia. "Please, come inside to wait. Mr. Urahara will be with you in a minute." With a yawn, Kazuki said, "No need to wait, Tessai, I'm up," from behind. He grinned at the two girls and the bigger man. "Ah, Ms. Kuchiki, Yuki. Hi, how can I help you?" Although Rukia was a little surprised by Urahara's familiarity with Miyuki, she chose to ignore it. She would not receive a response anyhow, given her knowledge of Miyuki and Urahara. Instead, she said, "My shipment, is it in?" Urahara blinked before he realized and nodded. When he said, "Right, of course, it's just in the back." When Miyuki said, "I'm here for Amahana," Kazuki's face barely changed, as though he had anticipated this. Rukia looked confusedly between the two and said, "Amahana?" Miyuki replied, "My Gikongan," to the somewhat shorter Ravenet. She decided not to disclose that Amahana was a mod soul who had been shipped out with other Gikongan by mistake. She had obtained it from Kazuki, who would otherwise be forced to destroy it, report it, or keep it forever. "Oka. Sama, you've returned," a childish voice exclaimed, cutting off Rukia's sentence. Miyuki groaned slightly as the tiny figure slammed into her, knocking her breath away. The entire store most likely heard Rukia's gasp. As the young noble looked more closely at the young girl who called Yuki her mother, Kazuki concealed a smile behind his fan. The girl was obviously neither an Arrancar nor a hollow. She therefore rejected the notion that the girl, who was neither older than Jinta nor Ururu, was Yuki's biological daughter, even though their faces were similar. Her hair was straight and rather neat, falling around her face and down her back to her butt. She was no taller than 4 feet 7 inches. With icy blue undertones, it was a vivid silver gray color. It might be mistaken for a very pale, icy blue in the correct lighting. She had pale skin that wasn't quite ivory. She had a distinctive hot pink eye. She was dressed in a leaf green kimono with silver swirling patterns running up and around the edges. In contrast, her obi was a light icy blue, one shade bluer than the color that accentuated her hair. She didn't have on any shoes. "Chan, it's only been a month or so." The child smiled and said, "2 months, Oka. Sama, but it's okay, I understand, Oji. Sama said you were looking after my new Odo, Sama." Amahana was thrilled when Oji told her about the boy her mother was helping and who would be her Odo, Sama, even though she had never had one before. However, Amahana's words caused Miyuki's eyes to widen, and she gave Kazuki a chilly glare. Kazuki just laughed uneasily behind his fan. With rhetoric, she asked, "Did he now?" "Yep," Amahana replied, nodding her head in a childlike manner. Rukia became somewhat anxious when she coughed to get their attention and they all turned to stare at her. When she said, "Yuki, who is this?" the young girl smiled and almost leapt to her feet. "Hello, my name is Amahana, Uzumaki Amahana, believe it." Urahara had no qualms about expressing his amusement, but Rukia had to suppress a laugh at how cute the girl with the icy hair was. She briefly considered hitting the man with her shoe or slamming his dumb fan over his head. Rukia missed how Miyuki twitched at the odd verbal tick Amahana had given. How the mod soul got a verbal tick like her own was beyond Miyuki's comprehension, but Miyuki sneezed. "You mentioned that Amahana was a Gikongan," Rukia started. Yuki clarified, She's simply special." She gestured to the stuffed bunny Amahana was holding and said, "She usually resides with Kazuki in a Gigai, like now, or in her stuffed animal. Instead of squealing with joy, Rukia chose to smile. How adorable. Do you like bunnies too, little one? Amahana returned the smile and nodded enthusiastically, and Rukia instantly forgot to challenge Miyuki's peculiar tale about Amahana's uniqueness in comparison to other Gikongan. She hadn't actually lied. Amahana, a modified soul, was unique. The soul of a young child who began calling her mother after Miyuki saved her. Because that's exactly who Miyuki was in Amahana's mind. Despite her abilities as a mod soul, she preferred to act as a means of swiftly removing Miyuki from her Gigai because she disliked fighting. She snorted and looked amused as Aim and Rukia talked about Chappie the rabbit. The animal seemed to captivate them both in a strange way. Like the affection she must have had for foxes. Anyway, Kazuki started, as was customary for him, sitting on the elevated portion of the shoten. Ururu, will you go get Ms. Kuchiki's order from the back? You can't miss it. Shyly, Ururu said, all right, and went to the rear. After she had finished discussing Chappie with her new friend, Amahana said, Oka. Sama, can I come home with you and Rukia? Wani-sama? Yuki said, that was the idea, Aim. Chan, and sat down next to Urahara. Amahana immediately ran over and jumped into her lap. You'll have to be in your plushie form, though. Amahana nodded while pouting. Although she preferred her Gigai, she didn't mind being in her bunny form because it allowed her to spend more time with Oka. Sama. The Jakan actually thought Miyuki was her mother, which made Rukia laugh. It was kind of sweet. Urahara was using a calculator to work on her order when Rukia moved to stand to the side of her and said, now, let's see. 60 tablets of. And. Now, Ms. Kuchiki, I don't mean to pry. Let's face it, it's really none of my business, but you need to be careful. I don't need to tell you that if you use too much, and over-synchronize with your Gigai, then you're gonna be in for a world of hurt when you finally jump ship. Rukia let out a sigh. She groaned and flexed her hand, saying, believe me, I know, but lately I've had a hard time getting the smallest movement out of this thing. With a rather erotic smile on his face, he said, want me to check it out for you? I'll cut you a sweet deal. Miyuki sighed in frustration as Rukia snarled and clenched her fist. She slammed the man's own fan into the top of his head, shattering it in the process, as if it were moving at the speed of light. They were certain that a lump would be noticeable if it weren't for his hat. Miyuki had kept her eyes shut the whole time, but when she heard the blonde's agonizing noises, she smirked and opened them. The man sobbed dramatically as he said, ow. So mean Yuki, for ruining yet another fan, my fan. Muttering, serves you right, ya perv, Yuki said. Rukia smirked silently in agreement as Amahana snickered. Mr. Urahara, Rukia said after a few seconds. She saw Ururu come back holding a bundle wrapped in white cloth. I'm curious, why doesn't Miyuki have any problems with her Gigai and how exactly did you two meet? Kazuki rubbed the back of his head and laughed. Well that's a long story, he said. I actually tried to purify her, thinking her to be a threat. She soon proved that she was only a threat if I made her one. The recollection made Yuki roll her eyes. It wasn't the first time a no.it.all Shinigami tried to do the same, she said. If I recall, you tried the same thing, Shorty. Rukia accepted the bundle Ururu offered her after turning away in shame. She let out a quiet sigh as she saw the duck candy dispenser inside. This is the only one you could get. It's the second most popular model out there, and it wasn't easy to get either. Rukia nodded but scowled slightly. This would suffice, but she really wanted Chappie. In any case, it was for Ichigo. When Kazuki started talking again, Rukia glanced at him and tucked the Gikongan away. I believe you also asked about Miyuki's Gigai. Truth be told, I had to create hers especially for her, seeing as she is an errand car, and a quite unique one at that. To be honest, a regular Gigai practically blew up when she attempted to settle in it. That is because they were first created with Shinigami in mind. I don't have the problem you're having because this Gigai was designed for me. It's the closest to being human again I'll ever get, said Miyuki. As Rukia took this in, she bit her lip. She felt bad about bringing up a potentially sensitive topic by asking more questions about Miyuki's Gigai. Kazuki said, I don't think I have to tell you, and Yuki to be careful, in a serious tone. But nonetheless, be careful Ms. Kuchiki, you can't fake it forever. Rukia nodded grimly, looking down a little. Anything that could go wrong would, and she should have known that. It was already third period when they arrived at school, and Rukia had dragged Ichigo out right away. She had made the decision to remain. Things started to get weird during lunch. She had questioned why Rukia and Ichigo hadn't returned to class, but she assumed a hollow had shown up. She knew right away that something was wrong when she saw Ichigo, or at least his body, outside the window after he had leapt from the ground below. Ichigo could not have jumped that high in his body, and the orange-haired boy outside the window was acting strangely. Before long, she realized what was happening. She initially believed it to be just the Gikongan Rukia had picked up, but that didn't make sense either. She learned all she needed to know by taking a closer look at his Ryotsu and the small chakra that all living things possessed, even if they were no longer able to use it. Like Amahana, she was a Kaizo Konpaku, or modified soul. She was shocked to discover that the mod soul was a brazen one by the time she had gotten out of her own thoughts because he had kissed Tatsuki's cheek in addition to coming onto Orihime. Around that time, chaos broke out, and Miyuki was left helpless to stop Tatsuki from attacking the mod soul inside Ichigo's body. Miyuki intervened after the second desk had been thrown, this time out the window, and she appeared prepared to throw a third desk. To keep them apart, she stood between them and extended one hand to each of them. Tatsuki almost roared, "Move Miyuki, he needs to feel pain." Yuki twitched at the intensity of her friend's rage. "Okay, that's enough," she replied. "Tatsuki, I think Ichigo's learned his lesson, right Ichigo?" She glanced at the mod soul, making it obvious that she thought he wasn't Ichigo. Regretfully, the mod soul was more impressed by the girl's beauty than by that. Long red hair, almost straight, with a slight curl and wave at the ends. Her dark red hair was the most obvious feature about her, but it was hardly perceptible. She had fair skin that was slightly ivory in tone. Each cheek has 3 exotic whisker birthmarks. Her eyes shone brighter than the sky, a deep ocean blue. She was also well built, curvaceous, but short, and most likely no more than 5 feet. She was arguably the most attractive and mature girl in the entire class, aside from Orihime, the girl with the orange hair. Ichigo?" she asked, but before she could say anything more, the lips covering her own and the arms around her waist cut her off. She stood almost on her tiptoes to maintain her balance against the taller boy, and her eyes widened as her brain tried to process what was happening. It wasn't until she felt a foreign tongue slide into her mouth that her mind began to function. The kiss continued for a few more seconds, but the door slammed open before she could punch Ichigo. A familiar voice demanded, "Stop this right now," before appearing to falter as she realized what was happening. The girl who had given him to Ichigo was standing there looking shocked, and the mod soul retreated. He noticed an equally shocked, almost horrified, substitute Soul Reaper looking out the window. Ichigo had come in time to witness the kiss's conclusion, so Rukia wasn't the only one who saw him kissing Miyuki. The mod soul said, "Guess it's time to go," but was cut off by a voice and a strong, ominous aura. "I don't think so." The mod soul's eyes widened as they turned. Miyuki stood with her hands balled into fists by her sides and her head bent. It appeared as though a large, smiling nine-tailed fox had appeared in the shadow of a blazing aura of crimson that bled into orange and black at its edges. He recoiled a little at the now dark, almost glowing eyes as she gazed up at him through her bangs. In the dark, like a predator pursuing its prey. She yelled, "That was my first kiss. You bastard!" The mod soul had hardly time to avoid her punch before it struck the blackboard and cracked it violently. As Miyuki, a normally calm girl, pursued down the person they believed to be Ichigo, causing more damage to the school's desk and other property in the process, the entire class watched in horror and a little fear. Sadly, or perhaps fortunately for Ichigo, the mod soul managed to evade her assaults. "Ichigo!" yelled Rukia, clearing her head with a shake. After being too stunned to act, Ichigo finally regained his composure and moved to stop the mod soul, who had just escaped a dropkick from a still angry Miyuki. After witnessing the damage caused by Yuki's kick, he couldn't help but feel relieved that the mod soul had avoided. He wanted to use his body to harm the mod soul even more at the same time. One could see a great deal of anger and, if they looked closely, a hint of jealousy in his eyes now that he had regained consciousness, not that he was even aware of what the feelings he was feeling were exactly. Ichigo sneered, his eyes narrowed at the soul inside his body that had destroyed his reputation in less than an hour. "You're not going anywhere, buddy," he said. Ichigo was surprised when the mod soul smirked and attacked. Miyuki had become sufficiently composed to observe the altercation between the two Ichigos. If one excluded the kisses she and Sasuke shared while she was still alive, which were both total accidents on their parts, she hadn't been lying when she claimed that was her first kiss. However, she had never experienced a true kiss, or what the humans now called a French kiss, as she understood it. She was only relieved that her first kiss had been stolen by Ichigo's body. Wait, what? I don't know where those thoughts came from, Yuki thought to herself, shaking them. However, the small voice in the back of her mind told her otherwise. Miyuki moaned as Ichigo wrapped a torn piece of her uniform blazer around her slender waist, concealing her wound. A few minutes later, almost an hour, to be honest, to allow Ichigo to tend to her wound, she sat with the white shirt underneath it unbuttoned from the bottom up to her ribs. Ichigo had insisted that it be resolved as soon as possible, but she had intended to wait and handle it herself or even enlist the assistance of Rukia or Kazuki. Even though it wasn't life threatening for someone like her, she had given in because it was pretty deep. Even if by the time he started cleaning the wound as best he could given their current circumstances, it had already started to heal. Despite having some of the best instant regeneration of any of the other deities and not having the healing she had in a guise, she still had healing that was close to regeneration, just like she did in a human. She was still an Uzumaki, after all, and they were known for their vigor, endurance, and longevity. However, she had sat down without saying anything. Rather, she had started shifting her clothing out of the way. The Orangette had initially responded as she had anticipated, as any prude, for want of a better term, would. Particularly when it appeared that she was going to fully unbutton the white shirt. After a few minutes, the boy was still very red and focused on the wound, avoiding anything that a 15-year-old boy might see, even though only her stomach was exposed. She chuckled to herself, amused. He's such a prude. After having two senseis who were perverts in their own right, she was able to identify a pervert with ease, which was kind of cute because most teenage boys these days were perverts. In retrospect, Ichigo is likely where the terms gentleman and chivalry originated. Ichigo said, there, as he wrapped the wound with the torn fabric from her blazer. That should hold, you should let my dad look at it later, he could do more. I'm sure it'll be mostly healed by then, but I'll still let him take a look. After continuing to nod, Miyuki let the white shirt drop back into position at the sides, where she had been keeping them out of the way. She rebuttoned her shirt out of sympathy for Ichigo and then raised his extended hand. Ichigo said, I'm sorry you got hurt, Yuki, and Miyuki shook her head. Her words, really Ichigo, I'm fine, I'll take a hell of a lot more than that measly scratch to kill me. Ichigo said sardonically, if that's what you call a scratch, I'd hate to see what you call fatal, but he still felt responsible for her injuries. She had to defend the mod soul that was driving his body because he was too slow to stop the hollow. He squinted at the mod soul, but he was unable to hold the soul that occupied his body solely responsible. Ichigo walked over to the mod soul, who was kneeling to observe a line of ants pass by, and asked, so, what's the big deal? The mod soul sighed, sorry, I guess I got caught up in the freedom having a body gave me. Miyuki couldn't resist asking, why did you save those kids, before you seemed ready to finish them yourself? She had been perplexed when she had arrived to discover the soul assisting those children. A few minutes earlier, hadn't he been prepared to beat them into oblivion? It's complicated, you see I had to help them. If I hadn't they would have been killed. No one should have the right to kill anyone, he grumbled. Right after my birth the Soul Society sent out the order to destroy all mod souls. The very day I was born they gave me a death sentence simply for existing. As Ichigo listened to the modified soul, his eyes grew wide. Hearing from the mod soul himself had an impact, even though Miyuki, who had only heard the bare basics from Amah, whom he had met briefly, had told him about what Soul Society had done to the mod souls. Since the mod souls had done nothing but exist and were put to death for Soul Society's transgressions, he could not fathom the kind of betrayal they must have felt. Miyuki listened with a scowl and narrowed eyes that were primarily sad and understanding but also slightly angry. She recalled the feelings of defeat and betrayal she had experienced as a human, and she could relate to the soul's emotions. She was raised in a village that, until much later in life, despised her. As the Jinchuriki of Kyubi, there had always been a sizable portion of people who couldn't and wouldn't stop hating her. I waited, fearing the inevitable, watching helplessly as the others were disposed of. My friends, family. But just as I thought it was over, I got lucky and was shipped out by mistake. It didn't matter though, I figured it was just borrowed time, until they found me and got rid of me. I've been alone a long time now, and it's given me time to think. The mod soul gave a pitiful smile. I decided that no one should have the right to take someone's life away. I exist, and I have a right to continue living my life as long as I want to. So I refuse to take another life. After that, there was silence, but it was broken a few seconds later. A man in his early to mid-20s said, Looky what we have here, and you're all beat up and wore out. He wore a characteristic green and white hat over his blonde hair. All that trouble for nothing, it seems. Wah. The guy's cane struck Ichigo's forehead, causing the pill to be forced out of his body, interrupting the mod. Soul. Yuki sighed. She could already see that things would become more complicated in the future, figuratively speaking. The following day, Miyuki was amused to see the mod. Soul, who was now living inside a stuffed lion, dive-bomb Ichigo's chest to wake him up. Or at least try. When Rukia arrived to take the mod. Soul yesterday, there had been a brief conversation amongst them all following Kazuki's arrival. Even though the mod. Soul annoyed her a lot, she couldn't let him be destroyed because he was essentially Amahana's kin. She had been seconds away from doing the same. Soon after, they departed, and Ichigo discovered the plush lion on a heap of trash on the way home from school. It was ideal for housing the mod. Soul because it appeared to be undamaged. Aim was wearing a plush toy, so they knew it would work. They had already told Rukia and Ichigo that Amahana was a mod. Soul before they had left the middle school's roof. Arg, damn it Kon, get off me, Ichigo sat up and cried out. The lion plush toy echoed, huh, Kon? Your name, Ichigo said, stroking his hair. It's short for Kaizo Konpaku. Kon yelled, what? But why do you get to choose? I think I like mod better. Miyuki could sense that he was relieved and, despite his denials, touched that Ichigo had chosen him. Kon had probably never had a name until now, but she had no idea how long he had been alive. Ichigo shrugged and raised an eyebrow. Kon. No, it's not cool or anything. Mod is a cooler name. Ichigo uttered the words, you're right, it is, which is why you're Kon, with a slight grin. Miyuki laughed and got up from her chair to brush out her long hair. She heard Rukia emerge from the closet and started to head for the door. Something that, given that she had been residing there for just over a month, was fast turning into her closet in their minds. When Miyuki realized Rukia's position, she blinked and couldn't stop the snickers from escaping. Unaware that Kon had fallen to the ground beneath her, she stood there half glaring at Ichigo, allowing him to see her school skirt. Kon whispered, nice, loudly enough to wake Rukia and Ichigo. AHHRG. Rukia practically snarled, her intense gaze fixed on the plush lion she had started to tread on. You little pervert. Kon cried out, help me, Yuki-chan, as he slipped out from under Rukia's foot. When Kon flew at Miyuki, she was clearly startled. The mod. Soul sank into the valley of her breast after his stuffed animal body struck her chest. Yuki's mind caught up to the situation and she began to blink. Ah, paradise. Yuki's cheeks flushed with shame and rage as Kon let out a joyful sigh. Ichigo and Rukia didn't appear to be doing any better, though Ichigo appeared both embarrassed and irate. Kon. She began, but was interrupted when a white stuffed bunny struck Kon and knocked them to the ground. The astonished lion is being punched by the bunny. Amahana yelled, what are you doing to my OKAA? Sama, and began repeatedly hitting Kon's head against the floor as she spoke. Get this crazy bunny off me, please. The plight of the perverted lion made all three of the teenagers who watched it laugh. Yuki acted with a smile of amusement a few seconds after she had calmed down. Aim, you can let Kon up, she mentioned. I think he's learned his lesson. Amahana abruptly stopped the bunny style stomping she had been doing on Kon. The female mod. Soul hopped off the battered lion with a smile, if a plush toy could do that. She said, if you say so, but it was clear that Amahana wasn't sure she agreed. Amahana snarled and turned to glare at her relatives. I'm watching you Konpaku, keep your pervy thoughts away from Oka. Sama or I'll tell Oto. Sama. Ichigo blushed in shame at what she said. When Yuki's mod. Soul called him that, he had hoped she wasn't being serious. Miyuki had forewarned him that Amahana would not likely change her mind once she had decided on what she called a new person. He wasn't particularly offended, but it was a little awkward, particularly since Aim had called Miyuki her mother. Particularly if she was in her gigai, someone might misinterpret. With little awareness of Oto Sama's identity, Kon retreated from Amahana. Wait, Sayuki. Chan is your girlfriend, Ichigo? Rukia fell to the ground in laughter as Ichigo and Miyuki became even more irate. Directly from Mod. Soul's mouth.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.